Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Nelson, and I'm in my mid-30s. I come from a family that's worked with machines for generations. Growing up in rural Montana, I spent my childhood fixing old bicycles and farm equipment with my father. His calloused hands taught mine how to breathe life back into rusted metal. But eventually, I moved to the city, chasing that American dream of stability that seemed so elusive back home. For nearly 7 years, I worked at an auto parts manufacturing plant in Detroit. The job gave me security. I carved out a comfortable routine, gradually saving money and planning for a modest future, nothing luxurious, but honest work. Then, during the economic crash of 2016, the plant suddenly closed. Nobody received any warning or time to prepare. I was laid off along with dozens of other workers, all of us wearing the same expression of desperation. For almost 4 months, I searched for work in various repair shops and parts stores across the city. I depleted my savings paying bills, buying groceries, traveling to interviews, and making small repairs to my aging Chevy that constantly broke down. When I was down to my last few $100s, unable to even cover next month's rent, my cousin Vincent called. He asked how I was doing, and I couldn't hide the despair in my voice. "I'm running this classic car restoration shop in Lakeside," he told me. "About 3 hours north of you. I need someone reliable who knows their way around an engine block." He promised that if I proved myself, I could establish myself quickly. "If you come up, I've already got a spot reserved for you in the shop. We can start fresh, Nelson," he said, his voice a mixture of concern and hope. I didn't hesitate. I sold almost everything I owned, climbed into my old car with its cracked body panels, and drove north to Lakeside, where Vincent lived. I settled into a small room near his workshop. On my first day, I realized the place was much simpler than I had imagined. A warehouse with scattered machinery, tools strewn about, and a large yard filled with rusting vehicles. But I appreciated the concept. I'd always loved working with my hands, especially on machines. Vincent introduced me to the team. There were 6 of us. One guy handled welding, another painting, and several others disassembled and cleaned parts. The only woman in the office, Marina, handled the paperwork. She immediately caught my attention. Around 25, with expressive eyes and a captivating way of speaking that seemed to pull you in. She greeted me with a welcoming smile. "Hi, Nelson. Heard we're colleagues now. If you need anything, just ask." I felt an unusual flutter when she looked at me. It seemed like she could see deeper than I wanted to show. But I didn't dwell on it. I focused on the work. I quickly learned the restoration process, dismantling each part of the car, analyzing what could be salvaged, sanding, replacing components, reassembling everything. It wasn't that different from my plant work, but now everything felt more artisanal, handcrafted. Oil dust and paint were everywhere. Meanwhile, Marina processed numerous parts orders and communicated with buyers interested in classic cars. Occasionally, I had to pass reports to her. The cost of each purchased part what needed restoration, estimated completion time for each stage. That's how we started spending more time together. I admit, at first I didn't think of Marina as anything other than a colleague. My main goal was to save money and pay off my debts. But over time, I noticed something gentle in Marina's manner. She always spoke to me softly, offered coffee, asked if I needed help with some spreadsheet. And when we were alone, she looked at me in a way that made my heart beat faster. Vincent seemed to pay no attention to this, or if he noticed something, he didn't show it. One day, after an exhausting shift, Marina invited me to a small bar on an unnamed corner of town. I was still covered in grease and dirt, but agreed without hesitation. At the bar, we talked about life. She told me she lived alone, had moved from somewhere out west, and barely maintained any relationship with her family. At some point, she gently touched my hand, and something in the air changed. "Are you always this serious, Nelson?" she asked with a slight smile. "I used to be more cheerful in my teenage years, but life has hardened me a bit," I replied, avoiding any emotional revelations. "Maybe we can change that," she said, without elaborating. When we left, it was already night. The goodbye lingered longer than usual. The embrace was warmer. In the following days, we began to grow closer. I wondered, would Vincent be angry if he found out something was developing between Marina and me? He had always been somewhat possessive about his business affairs, but I believed our family and work relationships were strong enough that this wouldn't create problems. A month later, when I had fully integrated into the workshop, Vincent invited me for a soda at a simple diner at the end of Friday's shift. "Nelson, I need to tell you something, but promise you won't judge," he began, fidgeting with his plastic cup. I agreed, not understanding where he was going. Then Vincent confessed that he occasionally hooked up with Marina. Nothing serious, just casual. But he asked me to keep it secret. He spoke as if it were commonplace, as if she were just a brief fling. He asked me to be careful, to ensure it wouldn't affect the atmosphere in the workshop. Everything mixed up in my head. I didn't know how to react. I had already started letting Marina's smiles into my heart. And suddenly, I learned that Vincent was also with her. That evening, I lied to him, saying everything was fine. But I couldn't sleep. Thoughts kept returning me to every conversation and every glance Marina and I had exchanged. Was I walking into a dead end? The next day, I tried to keep my distance from Marina at the workshop, but she noticed. "You seem different. Did something happen?" I couldn't lie and told her about the conversation with Vincent. She fell silent, but placed her hand on mine and asked me to hear her out calmly. She confessed that with Vincent, she had only a physical connection, but with me, something completely different, a deeper feeling. She said she had realized this recently and didn't want to lose me. Her words moved me, and I proved too weak to resist. We began meeting secretly. She reassured me, told me not to worry because she would soon end things with Vincent, as soon as the financial situation stabilized. She insisted that the office was truly growing quickly, and Vincent still needed her for administrative matters until he found a replacement. I didn't like this situation, but I followed the feelings that had already possessed me. And that's exactly when everything started falling apart. Within 2 weeks, Vincent began suffering from severe abdominal pain and a fever that wouldn't break. He had always been a healthy man, rarely sick. But suddenly, he couldn't even stand. They took him to the hospital, but doctors couldn't find a specific cause. It seemed as if something was draining him from within. During this period, all responsibility for the workshop fell on me. I had to manage deadlines, sales, parts purchases, and coordinate the team. Marina took on a serious position, saying we needed to work hard to keep everything functioning properly and not give rise to gossip. But I noticed a strange gleam in her eyes. At first, I thought it was just concern. One day, searching for contracts in Vincent's office, I came across a pouch wrapped in black cloth at the bottom of one of the drawers. When I opened it, I saw a photograph of Vincent, along with a bundle of hair tied with threads, and surrounded by strange symbols I couldn't recognize. There was also a doll made from patches of dark fabric. This sight filled me with strong revulsion. At first, I thought it might be some innocent superstitious thing, but I couldn't ignore the circumstances. Vincent was ill, and this bundle looked very deliberate. I put everything in a box and took it home, not knowing what to do. A few years back, I had a friend, Susie, who believed in prayers, negative energy, curses, and other spiritual practices. I decided to call her and describe what I'd found. I didn't mention names, just said the situation was delicate. Susie was silent for a few seconds, then advised me to seek someone who understood serious matters. You need to find a root worker or healer you can trust. Something tells me what you found isn't a joke, Nelson, she said with concern. I began carefully asking some people at work if they knew anyone who dealt with such things, trying not to arouse suspicion. The welder, Travis, mentioned a woman people consulted for advice. Her name was Miss Albertine. She lived in the rural outskirts in a simple cabin and received people who needed help. Getting to her wasn't easy. You had to drive on a bumpy dirt road, then walk through a patch of tall vegetation. One evening, I got in my car and drove, telling neither Marina nor anyone else. At the cabin, I knocked on the door. An elderly black woman emerged, leaning on a cane, and looked at me as if she already knew why I had come. "You came because of something bad you found at work?" she asked directly. A chill ran down my spine. I opened the box and showed her the items. She carefully turned them over in her hands and frowned. This was made to destroy the health and will of the person in the photo. "This is serious business. If not removed, this person will grow increasingly weaker," she said. I explained that the photo was of my cousin, who was currently being treated without any diagnosis. She just sighed as if it were obvious. It could have been done out of revenge or to remove someone from the path. The reasons may vary, but the result is always dangerous. I asked what to do. Miss Albertine explained that there was a special ritual to remove such a curse, but it required specific items: herbs, candles, prayers, and most importantly, the victim's willingness to accept help. I thanked her with a small sum for her time and for the items she would use for the ritual. She gave me precise instructions. That same night, I needed to place the bundle in the center of Vincent's office, light 3 blessed candles, recite the prayers she dictated to me, and then bury the remains. In a remote location where no one else would touch those things. But be aware, when witchcraft is removed, the energy returns to whoever sent it. And if that person did this with malicious intent, The consequences for them could be even more serious, she said. I was frightened by the mere thought of Marina. My mind insisted she might be involved, but I didn't want to fully believe it. I tried to push these thoughts away and returned home with a package of candles and a bundle of dried herbs. In the evening, when everyone had left the workshop, I entered Vincent's office, closed the door, and followed all the instructions. A strong smell of burned herbs spread throughout the room. There were no miraculous phenomena, but there was tension in the air, some elusive feeling of unease. Around midnight, I gathered the remains of the ritual, got in my car, and drove to a vacant lot several miles away. I dug a shallow hole and buried everything. When I returned, my hands were trembling, not from fear of something supernatural, but from the realization that I had gotten into something much deeper than a simple love triangle. In the following days, Vincent's condition began to slowly but surely improve. The fever subsided, his appetite returned. On the other hand, Marina began behaving strangely. She seemed constantly tired, spoke little, answered evasively. At first, I thought it was the effects of stress, but I noticed that sometimes she looked at me with deep anxiety in her eyes. Then one morning she knocked on my apartment door, asking to talk. I opened it. She was very pale, with deep dark circles under her eyes. She entered silently and sat on the couch, holding her head as if dizzy. I hesitated to ask what had happened. Then she spoke. Do you know something, Nelson? Something strange is happening. I see nightmares, my whole body aches. My heart races without reason. I feel like I'm seeing things in my apartment, but I don't know if they're hallucinations. I didn't know what to answer. She continued, everything's different at the workshop. Vincent is recovering, but I can't sleep normally. Everything seems out of place. I feel like something has turned against me. I confirmed that I knew about the existence of some witchcraft, but didn't accuse her. She cried, and unable to bear my silence, confessed. I just wanted Vincent to step back, to be free with you. I did what I was advised to do. They said he would get sick, but recover quickly. I didn't think it would go this far. Help me, please. It was hard to believe that she, with such a gentle appearance, had done such a thing. But I couldn't deny what I had seen myself. I was furious, but I also felt sorry for her. It was obvious she was suffering, whether psychologically or spiritually. I remembered Miss Albertine's words. The energy returns to whoever sent it. Marina, I don't know if I can do anything more. You need to accept the consequences of your actions. Maybe it's better to contact the same person who helped you with this, or someone who can break this connection. She began trembling, begged me to go with her somewhere she could be healed. I didn't have the strength to refuse. Despite everything, I didn't want to watch someone perish before my eyes. But over the next week, Marina only worsened. Her temperature rose and wouldn't come down. She lost weight, barely appeared at the workshop. Rumors circulated that she had a serious illness, and some even said it was retribution. One day I received a call from a psychiatric hospital. They said Marina had given my number as a contact because she seemed disoriented, and they had sent her there after a nervous breakdown. I visited her. She was agitated, barely recognized people, talked about presences that pursued her, mentioned shadows that pulled at her arms at night. There were no visible signs of this, but she was deeply affected, with an expression of panic on her face. I left there with a heavy heart. Vincent, on the contrary, had almost fully recovered, and I didn't know whether to tell him everything that had happened. In the end, I concealed the details, just said I had taken care of some planted package, so nothing else would harm him. He didn't ask many questions, focused more on returning to work at the shop. The atmosphere became lighter, people worked without tension. Cars were completed on time, new orders came in. But I was uneasy. My conscience pressed on me, knowing that Marina was in such a state, and that partly I had allowed everything to go so far. After all, I had allowed myself to get pulled into the situation. Perhaps I became the reason she turned to such methods. Weeks passed, I tried to move on, focusing on daily affairs. Vincent offered me the opportunity to head a new branch of the workshop in another, even more vibrant area. I agreed without hesitation. I needed a fresh start. However, shortly before the move, I began receiving strange calls from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard only heavy breathing and mumbling. Sometimes I thought it was Marina's voice, but always with significant background noise. The calls would end abruptly, and I couldn't say for sure whether it was my imagination or someone's cruel joke. I also noticed strange things in my small apartment. One evening I returned from the store and saw that the door was ajar, although I was certain I had locked it. I entered, quickly checked everything, and in the bedroom saw a crudely sewn rag doll left on the bed. I didn't know who could have placed it there. It looked old, unremarkable. Next to it lay a scrap of paper with incomprehensible scribbles. I became frightened. No matter how I tried to think rationally, I felt this was some form of psychological pressure related to the whole situation around Marina and the witchcraft. I called Susie, and she again advised seeking spiritual help. I got irritated, said I wasn't ready to start ghost hunting. She replied with just one thing. If I hadn't properly concluded this story, I might continue receiving echoes of that negative energy surrounding the whole affair. I still tried to avoid returning to this topic, but a series of events changed my attitude. For 2 nights in a row, I woke up with a feeling of heaviness in my chest and difficulty breathing. I went to the doctor. He said physically I was fine, perhaps it was anxiety. But I began to feel something wasn't right in my home. The air seemed unstable, heavy, something difficult to describe. Often things appeared not in their place. Doors closed by themselves with a dull thud, though there was no wind. I decided to consult Miss Albertine again, the woman who had helped me the first time. I told her about everything that was happening. She listened carefully, then said that possibly there was still some connection that hadn't been completely severed. She suggested that if Marina had died or gone mad as a result of that witchcraft, then the energy connected to me might have remained undissipated. I asked if there was another ritual that needed to be performed, but she replied that it all depended on where exactly this connection had taken strongest root. Was there a place that symbolized the beginning of this union? Perhaps a bar, apartment, or street where everything between you began to develop, she asked. I remembered the bar where Marina and I first had a drink together. That unexpected invitation then became the beginning of our growing closer. At this thought, an internal chill swept over me, but I maintained my composure. Miss Albertine gave me instructions. Take some coarse salt, white candles, and water mixed with certain herbs she gave me. It was important to be alone in that place and recite prayers to break any negative connection. On Monday evening, I went to that same bar. By then, it was already closed and seemed no longer operational. The doors were just pulled shut without a lock. I carefully entered inside, illuminating the space only with the flashlight on my phone. The chairs were stacked, the shelves empty, the air permeated with the smell of mold. I closed the door behind me, spread coarse salt in the corners, lit candles on one of the tables, and sprinkled them with the herbal water, reciting the recommended prayers. A strong desire to leave grew within me. My voice sounded strange in the silence. The atmosphere was heavy, as if this place preserved our memories very deeply. I prayed quietly, asking forgiveness for wrong choices, asking permission to move forward without carrying grudges. After a few minutes, I felt it was enough. I collected the remains of the candles, ran my hand over the rusty chairs, and left, closing the doors as I had found them. On the way to the car, my heart was beating wildly, but I tried to stay calm, repeating to myself that this was all part of an inner cleansing. I returned home with a sense of relief, though I wasn't entirely convinced of the ritual's real effect. That night I slept well. In the following days, I completed the move to the new branch workshop. The working atmosphere there was different. Everything was better organized, and I could finally focus on what truly mattered: a new beginning. Gradually, the strange calls stopped, and I no longer found any strange objects in my apartment. Over time, I began to believe that everything was finally settling down. About 3 months later, I met a woman named Dulce at a project management course I was taking for professional development. She had a calm nature, a genuine smile, and she naturally showed sympathy toward me, without pressure, without secrets. We began dating, talked about light topics, and I felt that my life had finally changed direction. Despite this, sometimes I remembered Marina. I still didn't know exactly what had happened to her after that breakdown. Rumors circulated that she had died, but nothing was officially confirmed. At the old workshop, they said family never appeared to sort out the situation, and that she simply disappeared from all records. I decided not to investigate further. Life itself had taught me that not everything requires a final explanation. I maintained contact with Vincent, who continued to run the business. He seemed calm, without particular resentment. We never openly spoke about Marina or witchcraft. Perhaps that was better. Sometimes he asked if I felt anything strange, and I replied that everything was fine, that I just wanted peace. I must confess that sometimes, when working late at the new shop, a momentary anxiety overtakes me, as if a part of me still expected some conclusion, but I fight against feeding this feeling. Life has taught me that some events leave traces that cannot be completely erased. But it's up to us to decide, to move forward and create new stories, not allowing the past to hold us captive. Today, after everything, I feel like I survived something that can only be described as a spiral of obsession. It wasn't an obvious horror movie, no screams, no monsters jumping from shadows, but it was a suffocating reality that made me doubt my own mind and my own values. Perhaps I'll never know whether all this was just emotional instability, or if some incomprehensible forces were truly at work. But one thing is certain, this experience changed me. I continue on my path, learning to forgive my own mistakes and not to play with circumstances that could lead to tragedy. I live one day at a time, avoid hasty judgments, because I've already been convinced. The boundary between what we call reality and what we consider supernatural may be much thinner than it seems. And as long as this lesson is engraved within me, I know I will never repeat the steps that once brought me to the edge. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening. My name is Ethan. I'm in my mid-30s now, but the events I'm about to share happened over 10 years ago. For the longest time, I tried to bury these memories in the furthest corner of my mind, thinking that if I never spoke about them, they might just disappear. But every time I woke up in the middle of the night with that same unease, I realized it was impossible. Back then, my life was pretty ordinary. I worked as an assistant at a vintage record store in a small coastal town in Oregon. It was a cramped space with narrow shelves where you could find everything from old vinyl records to obsolete music devices. Often, only 2 or 3 customers would come in all day. The owner, Mrs. Sullivan, was an elderly woman who reminded me of my grandmother. Despite her stern gaze, she had a good heart. When I wasn't at the store, I usually spent time with my 2 best friends, Tucker and Vince. Tucker was a true ball of energy, always coming up with excursions, meetups, any excuse to get out. He had a loud motorcycle that he stubbornly called his freedom machine, even though it broke down constantly. Vince, on the other hand, had a more reserved nature. He had been working as an intern at a local historical society and was intent on finishing his anthropology degree. He was fascinated by folk traditions, ritual ceremonies, and various curiosities he read about in books. I enjoyed listening to his theories, although I didn't much believe in what he called hidden forces. One foggy October evening in 2012, Vince came to me with news. There was going to be an art installation in an abandoned warehouse by the docks. The event was scheduled for that weekend and would feature independent artists, along with some small musical performances. Tucker immediately got excited. He was eager to meet new people and drink some craft beer. I wasn't really in the mood, but I agreed. I truly needed to break out of my routine, and something inside told me that something interesting might happen that night. On Saturday, I headed to the warehouse after closing the store. The night was crisp, with a thin mist rolling in from the ocean. There was a festive atmosphere in the air. Food trucks, art exhibitions on improvised panels, people sitting on the cement floor talking. I wandered through the space. I moved between the exhibits, seeing no trace of my friends, so I texted Tucker and Vince, telling them where I was. While waiting for a response, I noticed a small improvised stage where 3 musicians were performing some kind of experimental folk music. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to relax. That's when I saw her, a woman standing nearby, watching the stage. She wore a long, patterned dress with intricate geometric designs that reminded me of ancient symbols. There was something calm almost hypnotic about her gaze, and she held a matte glass tumbler in her hand. I don't know why she caught my attention. There were many people around, but my eyes kept returning to her. My phone vibrated. Tucker had written that he and Vince were by the entrance. I turned to find them, but before I could walk away, the woman crossed my path and greeted me with a smile. "Do you know if this band plays here often?" The question was so simple that I stuttered. I hadn't expected her to speak to me. I replied that I didn't think so. It seemed to be a special performance for the art installation. "I see. Interesting. I like how they blend traditional instruments with modern rhythms," she said calmly. But there was something in her demeanor that intrigued me. She seemed like she had seen a lot in life, though she didn't look particularly old. I agreed that I thought it was cool too, and just then Tucker appeared behind me, slapping my shoulder. "There you are. I'm starving. Let's grab something to eat." I introduced Tucker to the woman. Her name was Nessa. She smiled and said she'd gladly join us, as she was hungry too. We headed to one of the food trucks. Soon Vince joined us and entered the conversation. Within minutes, it seemed like they had all known each other for years. Nessa explained that she loved visiting alternative events and had come with friends, but they had scattered around the venue, so she ended up alone by the stage. After we ate, Nessa suggested we join her friends who were gathered a little further away. We approached a group of 4 women who introduced themselves with unusual names: Willow, Sage, Rowan, and Ivy. They all wore vibrant, layered clothing and carried fabric bags or backpacks slung across their shoulders. There was also a guy named Ash, who seemed to be the quietest of them all. They were talking about a trip they were planning for the upcoming Halloween weekend, something related to crafts and traditional dances at a location near the coast. Tucker immediately became interested. "I'm up for any adventure." "When are you leaving?" Sage laughed. "Probably next weekend. We've rented a simple house with rooms and a large yard. It's far from town, but the beaches there are amazing." Vince hesitated. He didn't like going places without proper preparation. He looked at me as if seeking my opinion. At that point, I wasn't sure if we should go. But Nessa, noticing our hesitation, convincingly said it would be a unique experience. People who value folk culture gather there, discussing, exchanging knowledge. I always learn something new when I'm there. She looked directly at me. "You might find it interesting to learn about these customs that you can hardly see in big cities anymore." As skeptical as I was, I have to admit, the offer intrigued me. Plus, Nessa's magnetism sparked genuine curiosity in me. She wasn't like anyone I'd met before. I talked with Tucker and Vince. I said that if they agreed, I would go too. They exchanged glances and shrugged, knowing I rarely agreed to such adventures. Tucker grinned widely, and Vince eventually agreed after a brief conversation with Willow. I casually mentioned to Vince about the unusual names in their group, but he said he knew many people who chose nature-based or mythological names for themselves, so it wasn't strange to him. During the next week, we kept in touch with Nessa's group through text messages. We occasionally met at coffee shops and craft fairs, having light conversations about music, literature, and culture in general. We eventually decided to travel by car. Nessa had managed to borrow a vehicle from a relative. Tucker was excited and said it would be our best trip yet. a perfect way to celebrate Halloween. The day of the journey arrived on a Friday morning. We met at an abandoned gas station we'd chosen as a meeting point to avoid drawing attention. Nessa pulled up in an old but well-maintained dark green SUV. Inside were already two of her friends, Rowan and Ivy. Tucker, Vince, and I got in, while the rest of the acquaintances were supposed to travel in another vehicle. We put our backpacks in the trunk and hit the road. The journey was long, and the landscapes changed with every mile. Dense forests gave way to fields, and then small villages began to appear. We stopped once to buy water, fruit, and some snacks. Nessa and her friends talked about traditional dances and songs they had discovered during previous journeys. Tucker and Vince, who had never encountered such a world, listened with interest. I tried to keep track of the route, but couldn't maintain focus. Landmarks slipped from memory. Nessa was behind the wheel most of the time, and we often got distracted by conversations, music, and laughter. I felt a strange euphoria, as if the entire journey had something hypnotic about it. By evening, we reached our destination. From a distance, we saw a single-story house without a fence, painted a weathered gray color. There were no neighbors nearby. The property was large, with trimmed grass and several trees on one side. Rowan opened the wooden gate, indicating we had arrived. We parked the car and started unloading our things. The air was salty. I guess the ocean wasn't far. We were accommodated in 2 rooms. Tucker, Vince, and I in one, and Nessa with her friends in another. The house had a spacious living room with minimal furniture, and a kitchen with an old refrigerator and a gas stove. From the beginning, I noticed that Rowan and Ivy seemed well-oriented. They knew where everything was, as if they had been there many times before. Nessa just smiled and said everything was organized. Early in the evening, we prepared a simple dinner. We cooked rice, vegetables, and fish bought on the way. Everything was very modest. Then we gathered in the living room to talk and laugh. A bit later, Sage and Willow arrived, bringing more bags and percussion instruments. Music arose spontaneously, in a light, casual atmosphere. They began playing drums and tambourines, singing songs that reminded me of tribal rhythms or folk festivals. I leaned against one of the few chairs, feeling a mixture of fascination and mild anxiety. Everything seemed relaxed, but there was something in Nessa's and the other women's voices that made me think. There seemed to be a very strong, almost tribal connection between them. Tucker, of course, immediately started dancing. Vince kept his distance, but was having fun clapping his hands. Later, Nessa called me outside. There was a backyard that stretched to a wire fence, beyond which was a cliff that, I assumed, descended to the sea. I followed her, feeling the fresher night breeze. She told me she had been coming to this place since her teenage years, thanks to a family friend. She said she liked coming here to quiet her thoughts. "Do you always look for something unusual?" I asked. "Not always, but I think there are things that not everyone can understand. I just like to feel what the world can offer without barriers." There was a certain poetry in her words, and for a few seconds, I didn't know what to say. She smiled slightly and returned to the house, leaving me in the yard staring into the darkness that covered the horizon. Later, almost everyone was tired and preparing for sleep. But Rowan and Ivy said they would do something special to harmonize the energies of the house. They went out with several candles and incense, with a sweet aroma. They explained it was an ancient custom, but didn't go into details. Vince called me to look outside. We saw them making small circles on the ground and placing lit candles in the center. They were whispering something, nothing comprehensible, just fragments. Then they silently returned to the house. The next morning, I was awakened by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and something baking in the oven. Nessa, full of energy, suggested going to the beach, which was a 15-minute walk away. Vince decided to stay at the house to read. Tucker agreed immediately. The other women and Ash also went. We followed a path of packed sand until we came out onto a wide beach where waves crashed against the shore. The view was beautiful, but there were almost no people. We spread blankets and began to talk. At some point, Nessa and her friends approached what looked like an improvised altar on the rocks. They seemed to be admiring drawings and symbols inscribed there. Tucker nudged me with his elbow curiously, but I just shook my head. I didn't think it necessary to interrupt them. They touched hanging objects that resembled ribbons or simple necklaces. I lay back down on the sand to rest a bit. When we returned home, it was almost noon. We noticed that Vince wasn't in the room or in the living room. We found only a note in which he wrote that he had gone to the village to buy some groceries. We spent the rest of the day quietly preparing food, talking, washing up with buckets in the yard since there was no shower. But in the evening, everything began to change. After dinner, Nessa and her friends arranged chairs in a circle. Sage took a guitar, Willow began to play a drum, and they sang a quiet, rhythmic song. They invited everyone to sit and offered a drink they called a home blend. It tasted like strong, slightly bitter tea. I felt a slight discomfort, but drank it so as not to offend them. Tucker drank it immediately without thinking. Vince, who had returned with provisions, took a sip, grimaced, but continued drinking. As the music and conversation continued, I noticed that the light bulbs in the house were turned off. The room was illuminated only by candles placed on the floor. The wind penetrating through the screenless windows brought the smell of the sea. Nessa sat next to me, saying nothing, just gently touching my forearm. I began to feel a kind of languor, perhaps from fatigue, but I didn't rule out the influence of the drink. Everyone's speech was becoming slower, and drowsiness seemed general. At one point, Rowan stood up and suggested everyone go outside. I didn't object, perhaps under the influence. With that strange feeling of lightness, stepping outside, I noticed that several candles were arranged on the ground, forming distinct patterns. A path of pebbles led us to a corner on the grass, and the wind was cooler. Sage and Ivy played percussion instruments in a slow rhythm. The mixing of sounds and candlelight created an atmosphere that, were it not for the strangeness, would have been even beautiful. Nessa quietly said something about honoring the forces of nature, and said it was a special moment for those who wanted to connect with something greater. Tucker, a bit confused, laughed, but remained in place, nodding his head as if hypnotized. Vince, keeping somewhat sober, looked around as if trying to understand what was happening. I asked him if everything was okay, and he shrugged. The music continued, accompanied by singing in a language I didn't recognize. The words sounded like a mantra. I felt my vision blur for a few seconds, but tried to stay on my feet. The air was becoming heavy, yet Nessa took my hand and led me to the center of the yard, where there was a circle of candles. My feet touched a substance on the ground, like fine powder. "Don't worry, it's a protection ritual," she said. I didn't know how to react. Willow led Tucker to another circle, and Ivy accompanied Vince to a third. Ash was also nearby, but it was hard to understand what he was saying. He seemed to be mumbling to himself, as if in another place. When I looked around, I saw Rowan throwing a handful of herbs into a cast-iron pot from which white smoke was emerging. The drum beats became louder. Nessa, standing in front of me, talked about clearing the mind and allowing the body to go with the flow. I felt my breathing quicken without apparent reason. I tried to step out of the circle, but my legs buckled. She noticed my anxiety and grabbed me by the shoulders, saying I would understand everything soon. Then I heard Tucker laughing loudly, a laugh that didn't fit the situation. "Do you really think this is safe?" he shouted in a confused tone, receiving no answer. Trying to keep calm, I looked at Vince's circle. He kept his eyes half closed, but wasn't protesting. The whole scene looked like a collective dream. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some artistic performance, but the determined expression on Nessa's and the others' faces made it clear this was no joke. Suddenly, the smoke that Rowan was producing began to fill the yard, and the smell intensified. I felt someone touching my back. When I turned, I saw Sage with a small clay vessel. She took my hand and poured a thick liquid, saying it would help me open my spirit. I pulled my hand away, but she insisted. At that moment, Tucker staggered and fell to his knees in the center of his circle, surrounded by scattered flowers and leaves, while Ivy uttered words I couldn't understand. Vince tried to stand up, but it seemed his body wouldn't obey. I called his name. He looked at me fearfully but didn't respond. Then Nessa's voice, very close, whispered in my ear something that made me freeze. "Trust us. From this moment on, everything will be different." I wanted to respond, but couldn't, as if my will had been numbed. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was looking at the sky and seeing the trees swaying in the wind. When I came to, I was lying on the living room floor, my head on an old pillow. It was quiet, only the wind whistling through the half-open doors. I slowly got up, feeling nauseous. My mouth was dry. No one was nearby, not in the room, nor in the kitchen. Intuitively, I opened the front door and went into the yard. The sun had already. Morning had begun, coloring everything in a reddish tint characteristic of the early hour. The candles were gone. There were marks on the ground as if the earth had been turned over, but nothing that could clearly indicate what had happened. I called for Tucker and Vince, but there was no answer. I walked around the house, searching the rooms, but found nothing. My legs trembled with each step. Then I noticed a trail of footprints leading beyond the yard, in the direction of the cliff. I followed them, stumbling over dry branches. The cliff descended to a kind of bay. I reached the edge but saw no one. I stood there for a while, not knowing whether to shout, descend, or run. I felt my head getting heavier, almost fainted. I imagined that Tucker and Vince were unconscious somewhere nearby and needed help, but I didn't know where to start looking for them. I returned to the house, hoping to find Nessa or someone from the group. The living room remained empty, without a trace of celebration or ritual. I searched the rooms. Rowan and Ivy's suitcases were no longer there. The closet where Nessa kept her things was open and empty. The kitchen had its back door open, hitting the wall from the wind. It seemed that everyone had left, leaving me alone. I looked at my backpack standing in the corner of the living room, took my mobile phone, but there was no signal. I tried again, but without success. I decided I needed to get out of there and seek help, but where to go? The road leading to the village was long and almost deserted, so it was dangerous to walk. The car in front of the house was gone. I took a deep breath, remembered that Vince had gone to the village on foot yesterday, so that was probably the only option. I gathered everything I could and left. I walked for several hours on a dirt road under the scorching sun. At a certain point, I saw a dusty road where old buses and motorcycles passed. I asked a guy where the nearest police station was. He pointed me toward a small settlement. I went in that direction, feeling my body exhausted and my mind gripped by panic. When I reached the station, I explained to the police that my friends had disappeared. I told them everything, or almost everything. The man who listened to me looked skeptical, showing little reaction, and said this area often became home to various groups organizing private events, and it wasn't uncommon for them to use substances that cause confusion or hallucinations. You said this house is near the beach. Yes, but I don't know its name, and I don't know the exact name of the locality. It's an isolated house, I replied. He sighed and called another officer to go with us. We got in their car and returned along the road, trying to find the same house. But I couldn't remember the route exactly, since Nessa had driven the car most of the time, and the road to the house seemed hidden. When we reached where I thought the entrance would be, we found only a passage, blocked and covered with high vegetation. There were no indications or numbers on the facade. We got out to look for any signs of a fence or gate, but thick brush obscured the view. We walked a bit more without success. The police officer, already impatient, said they would register the incident. But without exact landmarks, it was difficult for them to do anything concrete. I stayed in temporary housing near the police station. I used a pay phone to call my family. My father answered, and I could only say that I was okay, but I needed them to come get me. I didn't go into details. My cousin arrived the next day, and we returned home together. My legs ached and my head. I was confused, spent at least a week in bed, exhausted by fever and nightmares. When I began to recover, I contacted Tucker and Vince's families to tell them what had happened. They looked at me in despair. Tucker hadn't been heard from even before the trip, nor had Vince. I told them everything, hoping that no matter how absurd it sounded, they could help me find at least some traces. We registered a missing persons report, put up posters at bus stops and terminals, asked at hospitals, but all without result. The following months were a real ordeal. The feeling of guilt didn't leave me. If I hadn't agreed to that trip, perhaps none of this would have happened. Tucker and Vince's faces haunted me on the rare nights when I could sleep. I returned to the station several times, but each time heard the same answer. We have no new information. One day, a police officer called me aside and said that in coastal regions, there were rumors about rituals and cults, especially in abandoned houses. He said that when people disappear in such contexts, traces rarely remain. He also noted that many bodies are carried away by the waves, complicating the initial discovery. He recommended that the families and I contact volunteers and NGOs. We did so. We went to that area several times, talked with locals, showed photos of Tucker and Vince. Some people said they had seen similar young men on the road, but nothing specific. Time passed, and hope of finding them alive diminished. Tucker's mother called me every day, crying desperately. Vince had an older sister who fell into deep depression. I, not knowing how to move forward, lost my job at the record store, and my mental health deteriorated. It was almost a year later when we received the news we had so feared hearing. A fisherman had found human remains on a secluded beach, many miles from where the house supposedly was. The police collected what they could and asked relatives to go to the Forensic Institute. At first, attention was drawn to a silver cord that Tucker wore and Vince's ring. But official confirmation came months later through DNA tests. The families received confirmation through an official report. Soon there wasn't much to bury, only the parts that remained. I returned home broken. I spent several days locked in my room, refusing visitors. When I finally tried to return to life, I realized I couldn't be near places with many people, and couldn't listen to certain songs that reminded me of the trip. I moved to a suburb, trying to avoid all memories. But sometimes it seemed I saw Nessa on the street in the same colorful dress with that gaze that penetrated my soul. I would get scared and run in the other direction. I don't know if it was a consequence of my trauma or if there was something more, but those eyes seemed to follow me even from afar. Years passed, and we never found out who Nessa and the other people really were. I tried to track their names on social media, but found nothing. It was as if they had never existed. Those who heard my story thought I was making it up or exaggerating. I don't blame them for doubting, as sometimes I question the reality of what I experienced. But the consequences were too real to be just a product of my imagination. Today, I try to live as simply as possible, avoiding long conversations about the past. But I decided to record this story so I don't forget. Forget the nuances of events. If I die tomorrow, I want you to know that Tucker and Vince didn't disappear of their own will. They were taken by something that perhaps I will never understand. If anyone hears this, please be careful when meeting groups that offer spiritual practices and mix unknown substances. Sometimes the price turns out to be higher than one can pay. And yes, I still have nightmares. Wake up with a sweaty body, remembering that yard, the intense smell, and candles on the ground. From time to time, I hear in my head the echo of the drums that played that night. I don't know if these are memories, or if there's some presence trying to remind me that it's still not over. Despite this, I go on, carrying within me a void that nothing can fill. New Year's Eve is typically seen as a time of renewal, of leaving the past behind and starting a new chapter. But what if, amidst the fireworks and celebrations, stories emerge that reveal the more unsettling side of this night? I'm going to share an experience that makes us wonder what truly happens when the clock strikes midnight. A story that isn't just frightening, but invites us to reflect on the unexpected on what might be lurking on nights that, at first glance, seemed to be only about festivities and hope. It was the night before New Year's Eve of 2019. I was living in Montana, specifically in a region near Missoula, and was returning home after finishing the semester at the University of Washington in Seattle. Due to personal reasons, I needed to remain at the university for an additional week after classes ended, which meant I spent Christmas practically alone. The flight back was uneventful, but my mood was already terrible before even boarding. Being a dedicated Grizzlies fan, I learned at the airport that the team had lost their championship game, ending their season with a devastating defeat that hadn't happened since the early 90s, if I remember correctly. As if that wasn't enough, my flight ended up being delayed, ruining my family's New Year's Eve plans. The original idea was for all of us to drive together to my aunt's cabin, where there would be a celebration to ring in the new year. However, due to the delay, my parents decided to leave earlier, taking the main car. So I was left with the backup vehicle and the mission of making the journey alone. To ease the situation, my mother left our husky Luna with me for company. Although I wasn't at all excited about facing the road alone, Luna was always a great companion, so I tried to look at the situation positively. When the Uber dropped me off at home, it was already past 9 in the evening. I didn't bother unpacking, just threw everything in the car, called Luna, locked the house door, and set off. The route, as usual on Montana's secondary roads, had nothing interesting: empty fields, small stretches of forest, and darkness on all sides. There was just a thin layer of snow on the ground, which was a relief for me since driving in heavy snow was never something I enjoyed. The night was completely dark, the only illumination coming from the car's headlights, and occasionally from the exterior lights of some distant ranch house. About halfway through the journey, I noticed that Luna had started to become restless. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but it soon became clear that she needed to relieve herself. I sighed because there wasn't much to do besides stop at the first available space, which I soon found: a small recess in the road, large enough to park the car. I got out of the vehicle, hunching my hands in my pockets and trying to ignore the cold that cut like knives. Luna seemed immune to both the weather and the darkness, as one would expect from a husky. I let her out without a leash, trusting her obedience. She began sniffing at the edge of the forest, exploring everything calmly, but without going too far. Everything seemed normal until a loud sound came from the forest. It was a heavy, deliberate noise, very different from a simple branch breaking. It sounded like something or someone was moving quickly among the trees. My heart nearly jumped out of my mouth. I was paralyzed, trying to see something in the darkness beyond the first few trunks, but it was impossible to see anything. Before I could react, Luna darted into the forest. That was any dog owner's greatest fear. In seconds, she disappeared among the trees. I began to frantically call her name, but got no response. My chest was tight and my breathing labored. The intense cold made everything even worse. However, there was no option. I couldn't leave her there. Without thinking much, I ran after her, calling her back at the top of my lungs, not wanting to imagine what might lie ahead of her. The only light source I had was the weak flashlight on my cell phone and the pale reflection of snow on the ground. The darkness was so dense that I almost crashed into several trees as I ran. I continued until I couldn't bear it anymore, with my lungs burning because of the cold. When I needed to stop, I almost collapsed from exhaustion. I leaned against a tree, feeling like my legs would give out at any moment. I had no idea what to do. It was then that I heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere behind me. Not an animal sound, but something else entirely. Something that made the hairs on my neck stand up straight. I froze, straining my ears, trying to determine its direction or distance. There it was again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like soft footsteps in the snow. I spun around, my phone's flashlight cutting weakly through the darkness, but revealing nothing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees suddenly appearing taller, more menacing. I called Luna's name again, my voice cracking with fear. That's when I saw her. Luna was coming toward me, head lowered, trembling with fear, her tail tucked between her legs. I had never seen her like this. I fell to my knees and wrapped her in a tight hug, overcome by indescribable relief. She pressed her body against me, clearly terrified. It was at that moment that reality hit me again. We were still in the middle of the forest, and whatever was out there remained nearby. I got up immediately and told Luna to follow me. This time she obeyed without question, walking by my side as if her life depended on it. We tried to find our way back to the car, but I wasn't sure if I was heading in the right direction. Suddenly, the sound of breaking branches behind me made my heart race. The noises continued, as if something was pursuing us. Then I heard voices, distant at first, but growing closer. Not normal conversational voices, but something rhythmic, almost like chanting, coming from multiple directions at once. My fear was so intense that I felt genuine panic that this would be my end, that I would be attacked right there. By luck or miracle, Luna found the way back to the car. I threw her inside and slammed the door shut, getting into the driver's seat. I looked one last time at the forest and felt my stomach turn. 7 figures were standing at the edge of the trees, watching us intently. Their faces were obscured by what looked like crude masks, made from branches and leaves. One of them held what appeared to be a long, curved blade that caught the moonlight. Without hesitation, I turned the key and sped away with the car. I didn't look back nor slow down. My entire body was shaking. A few miles later, I noticed something terrible. Luna was bleeding. I panicked upon noticing a cut right below her shoulder blade. It was deep, as if someone had used a knife or something similar. I abruptly pulled over and rushed to open the trunk. My mother had a habit of keeping a first aid kit in each car, and at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. With trembling hands, I cleaned Luna's wound and wrapped the area with gauze. She whimpered, and I felt awful for causing her pain, but I knew I needed to take care of it. For the first time, I was able to breathe a little easier. That ordeal had finally ended. I continued driving, but the whole scene wouldn't leave my head. The sensation of being followed, the fear of dying, the sight of those figures in the forest with their strange masks and ritual-like behavior. It all seemed like a nightmare I couldn't shake. When I reached my destination, I didn't tell anything to my parents or relatives. I'm not sure why I made that decision. Perhaps because it was something I preferred to keep to myself, as if talking about it would make the experience even more real. The strangest part: 3 days later, when I took Luna to the vet to have her wound properly treated, the veterinarian found something embedded in the cut. A small, carved wooden symbol, like nothing I'd ever seen before. The vet couldn't explain how it got there or what it was. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I think I can hear those chanting voices again, just at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes, I wonder if whatever was in those woods followed us home that night. I spent my early 30s working for an upscale catering company that specialized in corporate retreats and exclusive events. Our services ranged from simple food deliveries to full-service experiences where we'd cook and serve everything on location. Winter was always our busiest season in Maine, with holiday parties and year-end gatherings filling our calendar from November through January. It was at one of these events, held at the historic Evergreen Lodge nestled deep in the pine forests outside of Coldwater, Maine, that I experienced something that still haunts me to this day. A blend of unexplainable phenomenon and bone-chilling fear. We had been contracted by what we were told was a financial consulting firm. I'll refrain from naming them for reasons that will become obvious. The gathering was supposedly for their executive team, and like most corporate functions, there was meant to be a strict limit on alcohol to maintain professionalism. At least, that's what we were led to believe initially. As the evening progressed, something felt increasingly off. None of us could figure out where all the additional liquor was coming from, but the atmosphere shifted noticeably as glasses kept being refilled. My fellow servers and I began exchanging glances as we realized these weren't ordinary business executives. There was something about them, a certain hardness in their eyes, coded language in their conversations. How do I put this delicately? They were the kind of people who resolve problems for others, if you catch my meaning. Despite the growing unease, I have to admit they treated our staff with surprising courtesy. The tips were generous, unusually so, and they maintained a veneer of politeness that felt practiced and deliberate. Yet it was impossible to ignore the occasional flash of a holster beneath an expensive jacket, or the way conversations would abruptly cease when any of us approached certain tables. Things took a concerning turn when our event coordinator pulled me aside and instructed us to ignore the previously agreed-upon alcohol restrictions. When I hesitated, she simply said, "The client has made it worth our while." The implication was clear. Someone had been paid handsomely to look the other way. By midnight, the elegant veneer of the gathering had deteriorated significantly. In the far corner of the grand hall, 3 men were engaged in a heated argument, their voices rising with each exchange. Near the fireplace, I witnessed 2 others casually handling what appeared to be unregistered firearms, taking turns aiming at various objects around the room as if it were some perverse game. Our team decided to expedite our cleanup and departure. While loading our equipment into the van, with snowflakes beginning to fall in the darkness, gunshots suddenly rang out from somewhere inside the lodge. Not celebratory shots into the air as I had initially assumed, but the unmistakable sound of an altercation turning violent. We hurriedly finished our inventory, only to discover we were missing an entire tray of silver serving utensils. items that would cost us dearly if not returned. Against my better judgment, I volunteered to retrieve them, promising my colleagues I'd be quick. As I approached the service entrance, I was relieved to see one of the lodge's custodians waiting with our missing items. He handed them over wordlessly, his expression grave. As I thanked him and turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small figure moving along the stone wall that surrounded the property. It was a child, a boy who couldn't have been older than 10, balancing precariously on the narrow ledge of the wall. His movements unnaturally fluid despite the freezing temperature and now falling snow. He wore what looked like summer clothes, shorts, and a light t-shirt, entirely inappropriate for a Maine winter night. The custodian noticed my stare and placed a hand firmly on my shoulder. "Don't mind him," he said in a low voice that seemed deliberately calm. "It's nothing to concern yourself with. He comes and goes. Best you get back to your people now." His tone carried an urgency that made me comply without question. Back in the van, I described what I'd seen to my colleagues. None of it made sense. The lodge was miles from the nearest residence, accessible only by a single winding road that had been partially obscured by snow. Where had this child come from? What was he doing out in the bitter cold? And why was he trying to enter a property filled with dangerous individuals? We speculated briefly that perhaps he was a local kid on a dare, or maybe related to one of the lodge staff. But something about the custodian's reaction suggested a familiarity with the situation that went beyond a simple trespassing incident. 2 days later, while finalizing details for an upcoming wedding reception, my boss called me into his office. "Mitchell told me about what happened at Evergreen," he said, referring to our event coordinator. "Not just about our clients, but about what you saw outside. The boy on the wall." I nodded, surprised this detail had made it back to him. He gestured for me to close the door. "Listen carefully," he began, his voice unusually solemn. "I've been in this business for 27 years. We've catered at Evergreen more times than I can count. Those particular clients have used our services before, and that boy you saw, he's been spotted by at least 6 of my staff over the years." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "There are some things in this world that defy explanation, things we're better off leaving alone. We go in, do our job, and leave. That's always been my policy." He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite us being alone in the office. "The property manager at Evergreen, we go way back, played hockey together in high school, told me something after a similar event for the same group about 15 years ago. A boy matching that exact description was seen climbing the wall. One of the guests, liquored up and showing off, pulled out a gun and shot him. Right in the head. Point blank. My blood ran cold as he continued. They laughed about it, called it target practice. No one ever reported it. No missing child cases in the area. No body was ever found, officially anyway. The manager thinks they buried him somewhere on the grounds. Since then," he went on, "staff at the lodge report seeing him periodically, always at night, always walking along that same section of wall. They try to keep people away from that area after dark, claiming structural concerns or wildlife." What he said next has stayed with me for years. "Remember Thomas? Worked with us for the summer season 3 years back. Big guy, former military. He quit without notice after an event at Evergreen. Called me at 2 in the morning, voice shaking, saying he was done. He'd seen the boy up close. Said the kid's skin was pale as the moon, and there was a perfectly round hole in his forehead, clean through to the other side. But the worst part, according to Thomas, was the eyes completely vacant, yet somehow still. Searching, my boss rubbed his face wearily. The staff at Evergreen have an unspoken protocol now. If they see him, they keep their distance. He appears, walks the wall for exactly 13 minutes, then vanishes, not leaves, not climbs down, just disappears. As he spoke, I recalled the unnatural grace with which the boy had balanced on the wall, how his movements seemed to flow like water despite the treacherous conditions. I shuddered, thinking how close I might have come to seeing his face. I've declined every assignment at Evergreen Lodge since that night. I know it continues to operate, catering to wealthy clients seeking discretion among its recently renovated historic halls. Sometimes I wonder if the boy's family ever learned what happened to their son, or if they're still searching, unaware that he's trapped in some liminal space between our world and whatever lies beyond. They say children's spirits carry a particular resonance, an energy that allows them to manifest more easily than adults. I've often wondered if his appearances are attempts to seek justice, or perhaps simply a replay of his final moments, doomed to repeat endlessly until someone acknowledges the truth. What troubles me most isn't just the memory of that small figure walking the wall. It's the realization that everyone involved seems to accept the haunting as simply another cost of doing business. The lodge staff, the custodian, even my boss, they've all made their peace with this child's restless spirit, treating it as just another occupational hazard, like broken glasses or difficult clients. I left the catering business 6 months later. Couldn't stomach it anymore, knowing what I knew. Sometimes on cold winter nights, when the wind howls through the trees around my new home in Arizona, I imagine I can see a small silhouette balancing precariously on my garden wall. And though I know it's impossible, that whatever binds that child's spirit must surely be tied to Evergreen Lodge, I still find myself avoiding looking out my windows after dark, especially when it snows. What I'm about to share still haunts my thoughts, especially during this time of year. It happened on Halloween night several years ago. I was driving to my brother's place in rural Montana to join his family celebration. He lives about 4 hours away in a secluded area near the mountains. So I decided to leave in the late afternoon, figuring I'd have plenty of time to arrive with some cushion. The journey should have been straightforward. I actually enjoy long drives. They give me time to reflect and clear my head. But nature had different plans for me that night. About an hour after I got on the road, fog began to roll in. At first, it was just wisps, almost ethereal, the way it curled through the air and transformed the landscape into something from an old horror film. I remember thinking how perfectly atmospheric it was for Halloween night. However, admiring the weather seemed to tempt fate, because the fog only grew thicker as I continued. What had started as something beautifully eerie quickly morphed into a dangerous wall of white. The road became treacherous, and visibility dropped to mere feet in front of my car. My old Jeep Cherokee, despite its reputation for handling tough conditions, struggled as the winding mountain roads grew slick, with unexpected early frost beneath the fog. When I nearly skidded off the road at a sharp curve, I decided it was time to stop. Risking my life wasn't part of the evening's agenda. My mistake was not checking the weather forecast more carefully before leaving. I pulled over at a safe spot on the shoulder, far enough from what little traffic still passed by. I texted my brother to explain the situation. He was immediately concerned. I tried my best to reassure him, though I wasn't feeling particularly confident myself. I decided to wait for the fog to thin out, hoping it would happen quickly. But reality wasn't on my side. The fog only thickened, enveloping my car and obscuring the road ahead completely. After about 90 minutes, it became obvious I wouldn't be continuing my journey that night. My brother offered to come get me, but I refused. It would have been madness for him to drive in these conditions. I proposed that if things didn't improve, I'd call highway patrol. He reluctantly agreed. Calling the authorities, however, was my last resort. I didn't have roadside assistance coverage on my insurance, so I was on my own. I kept telling myself the fog would eventually lift. If it got too late or I became too exhausted, then I'd call emergency services. The thought of spending Halloween night alone in my car in the middle of nowhere left me uneasy. I didn't want to waste all my gas trying to stay warm or risk draining the battery with lights or the engine. I opted to turn the car on only occasionally, conserving as much fuel as possible. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the isolation of my situation began to weigh on me. That's when I noticed headlights appearing in my rearview mirror, cutting through the dense fog. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over me, almost like winning the lottery. It was a tow truck that pulled up beside me. I thought to myself, I'm saved now. I rolled down my window as the driver leaned over to speak. He was an older man, perhaps in his 50s, his face weathered like someone who had endured many harsh winters. But instead of speaking immediately, he just stared at me. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, leaving me perplexed. He finally asked in a gravelly voice that suggested years of smoking whether I was okay. There was something slightly intimidating about his manner. I responded that my vehicle wasn't equipped to handle these conditions, trying to balance politeness with firmness in my tone. He nodded slowly and commented that I indeed wouldn't get far with that vehicle, especially in this kind of weather. We lapsed into silence for a few seconds, as if he was carefully choosing his words. I noticed him glancing at the back seat of my car, almost as if searching for something. Before I could say anything more, he offered me a ride. My initial reaction was hesitation. I didn't know him, and something about his demeanor made me uncomfortable. Still, he seemed sincere, and the idea of spending the entire night in my car seemed simply irrational given the dropping temperature. I asked if he could take me to my brother's place, and he said it wouldn't be a problem. I also questioned what I should do about my car, to which he responded with a dismissive gesture, suggesting it was better to just leave it there. After contemplating briefly, I agreed. I grabbed my backpack, climbed into the truck cabin, and was immediately enveloped by the warmth from the heater, which relaxed my tense muscles. He asked where I was headed, and I explained the directions to my brother's house. He nodded, but afterward didn't say much. The silence initially seemed peaceful, but as time passed, I began to feel uneasy. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't going in the direction I had indicated. My phone's GPS showed we were heading in the opposite direction. The roads there were quite simple, with only two possible directions, and we were clearly taking the wrong one. I tried to remain calm and asked in the most controlled voice I could manage if we were on the right path. I don't think my attempt was very convincing, because I sensed a slight change in his posture after my question. Without looking at me, he replied that he was taking a small detour because the back roads would be better than the main highway in these conditions. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but the way he said it left me apprehensive. We continued on, and he did indeed exit the highway onto a smaller road that, according to my GPS, pointed roughly in the correct direction. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. I began to observe the truck's interior more carefully. I spotted empty whiskey bottles on the floor near his feet, crumpled maps in the side compartments, and between the seats, a hunting knife with an unusually large blade. My heart raced, and I worried he could hear it pounding in my chest. When it became clear he wasn't following the GPS directions and was ignoring all the correct exits, my desperation only grew. Then I spotted a structure in the distance, a gas station, the only building visible for miles. It seemed like my only chance. I waited until we were closer, took a deep breath, and grabbed the door handle. In one quick movement, I pushed the door open with my foot, feeling the cold air hit me like a slap. I tumbled out onto the gravel, feeling a sharp pain in my ankle as I landed, but I kept running toward the gas station. He shouted something behind me, and when I glanced back briefly, I saw him reaching into the glove compartment, possibly searching for a weapon. I didn't wait to find out. I ran as fast as I could, trying not to slip on the frosty ground. When I reached the gas station door, I pounded on it with all my strength and screamed for help. The attendant and another customer quickly pulled me inside. I collapsed on the floor, breathless, and told them what had happened. They didn't hesitate. They immediately called the police. By the time the officers arrived, the tow truck had vanished. They informed me they would search the area, but admitted that with the thick fog, locating the vehicle would be difficult. They ended up driving me to my brother's house, and even helped arrange for my car to be properly towed the next day. I was immensely grateful for their assistance. My brother, on the other hand, was furious when he heard what had happened. Since that night, I've avoided driving in fog or remote areas after dark. Every now and then, I find myself wondering what might have happened if I hadn't jumped from that truck when I did. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Sometimes I still see that hunting knife in my dreams, gleaming between the seats, waiting. And whenever Halloween approaches and the fog rolls in, I remember that strange man's eyes in the rearview mirror, cold and calculating, and I take the long way home. It was the last day of December 2007, and all of us were anxiously awaiting the end of a year that seemed endless. James, my college roommate, was hosting a party at his parents' lake house in northern Michigan. I arrived early to help with preparations, and to claim a spot in the guest room so I could drive there, drink freely, and not worry about getting home. His parents were spending the winter in Arizona, leaving us the perfect party venue. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, coating everything in a pristine white blanket that glowed eerily under the moonlight. By 9 o'clock, the lake house was filled with our closest friends, plus several people James knew from his internship, whom I'd never met before. The atmosphere was electric, with that unique end-of-year energy. Everyone was dressed in their finest, drinking champagne from plastic cups, while music thundered through James's expensive speaker system. His family's lake house was a beautiful 2-story structure with large windows overlooking the frozen water, now just a vast expanse of white in the darkness. When midnight arrived, we raised our glasses for the expected toast, cheering Happy New Year over the sound of fireworks exploding across the lake. After that, the group began to disperse. Some headed to bars in town that were staying open late. Others returned to their cabins or homes nearby. Gradually, the number of guests dwindled, and what had once been a noisy crowd became a small, quiet gathering of close friends, drinking and talking in the living room until the early hours. The fire in the stone fireplace had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Around 3 in the morning, the last people who weren't staying overnight departed, trudging through the snow to their cars. That left only me, James, and Tyler, who was practically passed out on the leather couch, an empty bottle of bourbon on the floor beside him. When the house fell completely silent, we began to hear an odd sound occasionally piercing the quiet. Initially, we couldn't identify it. It resembled a creaking noise, somewhat rhythmic but irregular. We thought it might be the old water heater in the basement, or perhaps the house settling in the cold. It may sound foolish now, but old houses make strange noises, especially during winter. And since we weren't entirely sober, the sound took a while to pull us from our late-night conversation about futures and resolutions. After some time, the disturbance became impossible to ignore. We followed the sound through the kitchen, but quickly realized it wasn't coming from there. As we approached the door that led to the basement, it became clear that the noise was emanating from below. James pulled open the door, and the creaking became more distinct, almost deliberate in its rhythm. "Go down and check it out," I suggested, half joking. "No way," he shot back, his voice betraying a nervousness I'd never heard before. He decided to shout into the darkness, "Hey, is somebody down there?" As soon as he finished his sentence, the sound stopped abruptly. We stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute, without hearing anything. The silence was somehow worse than the creaking. Finally, we decided to descend together. We grabbed fireplace pokers from the stand, perhaps due to the alcohol. We thought they would be useful, though they probably only increased our chances of hurting ourselves. The basement stairs creaked under our weight as we descended carefully, the wooden steps worn smooth from decades of use. The basement of the lake house wasn't very large, but it was finished with an old sofa, a vintage television set, a small bar area, and stacks of board games. In one corner sat a dusty card table, and scattered throughout were boxes of old Christmas decorations and fishing gear. The air was noticeably colder down there, our breath forming small clouds in front of our faces. First, we checked all possible hiding spots, looking behind the bar and in the small storage room. Then we focused on understanding where the noise had come from. That's when I noticed a rocking chair near the basement's only window, which looked out at ground level to the snow-covered yard. I sat in it and began to rock. The sound was exactly what we'd heard upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak with each backward motion. James looked at me with an expression that made my skin crawl. "That chair shouldn't be moving on its own," he whispered. "Nobody's been down here in months." We had never run so fast. We slammed the basement door shut as soon as we reached the top of the stairs, turning the old key in the lock. We spent a good while trying to rationalize what had happened, but no explanation made sense. The house was securely locked, the snow outside undisturbed by footprints. There was no way anyone could have entered. James kept the door locked until his parents returned a week later. When they finally ventured down, they confirmed there was no one there. But something had definitely moved that rocking chair. We later discovered the chair had belonged to his grandmother, who had passed away in that house many years ago. His mother had kept it out of emotional attachment, unable to part with her mother's favorite seat. Since then, I've never experienced anything resembling what people call supernatural phenomena. But just remembering that night, the way the chair moved with no one in it, the perfect rhythm of its creaking through the silent house, it still sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes when I'm alone at night and hear an unexplained noise, my mind immediately returns to that snowy New Year's Eve and the empty rocking chair that wasn't empty at all. It was the last day of December 2007, and all of us were anxiously awaiting the end of a year that seemed endless. James, my college roommate, was hosting a party at his parents' lake house in northern Michigan. I arrived early to help with preparations and to claim a spot in the guest room so I could drive there, drink freely, and not worry about getting home. His parents were spending the winter in Arizona, leaving us the perfect party venue. The snow had been falling steadily since morning, coating everything in a pristine white blanket that glowed eerily under the moonlight. By 9 o'clock, the lake house was filled with our closest friends, plus several people James knew from his internship, whom I'd never met before. The atmosphere was electric, with that unique end-of-year energy. Everyone was dressed in their finest, drinking champagne from plastic cups, while music thundered through James's expensive speaker system. His family's lake house was a beautiful 2-story structure with large windows overlooking the frozen water, now just a vast expanse of white in the darkness. When midnight arrived, we raised our glasses for the expected toast, cheering Happy New Year over the sound of fireworks exploding across the lake. After that, the group began to disperse. Some headed to bars in town that were staying open late. Others returned to their cabins or homes nearby. Gradually, the number of guests dwindled, and what had once been a noisy crowd became a small, quiet gathering of close friends, drinking and talking in the living room until the early hours. The fire in the stone fireplace had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Around 3 in the morning, the last people who weren't staying overnight departed, trudging through the snow to their cars. That left only me, James, and Tyler, who was practically passed out on the leather couch, an empty bottle of bourbon on the floor beside him. When the house fell completely silent, we began to hear an odd sound occasionally occasionally piercing the quiet. Initially, we couldn't identify it. It resembled a creaking noise, somewhat rhythmic but irregular. We thought it might be the old water heater in the basement, or perhaps the house settling in the cold. It may sound foolish now, but old houses make strange noises, especially during winter. And since we weren't entirely sober, the sound took a while to pull us from our late-night conversation about futures and resolutions. After some time, the disturbance became impossible to ignore. We followed the sound through the kitchen, but quickly realized it wasn't coming from there. As we approached the door that led to the basement, it became clear that the noise was emanating from below. James pulled open the door, and the creaking became more distinct, almost deliberate in its rhythm. "Go down and check it out," I suggested, half joking. "No way," he shot back, his voice betraying a nervousness I'd never heard before. He decided to shout into the darkness, "Hey, is somebody down there?" As soon as he finished his sentence, the sound stopped abruptly. We stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute without hearing anything. The silence was somehow worse than the creaking. Finally, we decided to descend together. We grabbed fireplace pokers from the stand, perhaps due to the alcohol. We thought they would be useful, though they probably only increased our chances of hurting ourselves. The basement stairs creaked under our weight as we descended carefully, the wooden steps worn smooth from decades of use. The basement of the lake house wasn't very large, but it was finished with an old sofa, a vintage television set, a small bar area, and stacks of board games. In one corner sat a dusty card table, and scattered throughout were boxes of old Christmas decorations and fishing gear. The air was noticeably colder down there, our breath forming small clouds in front of our faces. First, we checked all possible hiding spots, looking behind the bar and in the small storage room. Then we focused on understanding where the noise had come from. That's when I noticed a rocking chair near the basement's only window, which looked out at ground level to the snow-covered yard. I sat in it and began to rock. The sound was exactly what we'd heard upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak with each backward motion. James looked at me with an expression that made my skin crawl. "That chair shouldn't be moving on its own," he whispered. "Nobody's been down here in months." We had never run so fast. We slammed the basement door shut as soon as we reached the top of the stairs, turning the old key in the lock. We spent a good while trying to rationalize what had happened, but no explanation made sense. The house was securely locked, the snow outside undisturbed by footprints. There was no way anyone could have entered. James kept the door locked until his parents returned a week later. When they finally ventured down, they confirmed there was no one there. But something had definitely moved that rocking chair. We later discovered the chair had belonged to his grandmother, who had passed away in that house many years ago. His mother had kept it out of emotional attachment, unable to part with her mother's favorite seat. Since then, I've never experienced anything resembling what people call supernatural phenomena. But just remembering that night, the way the chair moved with no one in it, the perfect rhythm of its creaking through the silent house, it still sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes when I'm alone at night and hear an unexplained noise, my mind immediately returns to that snowy New Year's Eve and the empty rocking chair that wasn't empty at all. I've never been drawn to parties. Even back in college, I quickly tired of the constant socializing. I've always preferred quieter gatherings, surrounded by a few close friends. I grew up in a remote part of northern Maine, and what I'm about to tell you happened just a few years ago. Since I was a kid, my father and his friends had this peculiar tradition of spending New Year's Eve fishing on a secluded river, while everyone else celebrated in more conventional ways. With a mother who was rarely present and few relatives nearby, my New Year's transitions were marked by cool nights by the water alongside my dad, my brother, my uncle, and a few family friends. Things changed over time. My father is no longer with us, and my brother moved to Seattle years ago. Even so, I do my best to maintain the tradition, especially on New Year's Eve. Perhaps it's a way to honor those moments. Fortunately, my two best friends, Mark and Tyler, share this adventurous spirit. They're the type who thrive in nature, more at home on forest trails and riverbanks than city streets. This connection brought us together, and together we keep the tradition alive, which is great because spending New Year's alone would be utterly dismal. That day, Mark was responsible for driving his pickup truck. It was perfect for the terrain, large tires, four-wheel drive, and plenty of space for all our equipment. We brought everything we'd need: rods, bait, reels, a small inflatable boat to reach the best spots, and a portable shelter to protect us from the biting cold or the possibility of winter snow. The forecast predicted stable weather, but in northern Maine, the climate is unpredictable, so we prepared for the worst, or at least we thought we did. The river we were headed to was our private sanctuary, hidden within dense forest. It was the kind of place nobody would stumble upon by accident, and we loved that. The water flowed calmly in most sections, even when the season wasn't particularly rainy. As Mark drove down the dirt road, our excitement grew. There's something magical about the silence of fishing, just you, your friends, and that anticipation of catching something, far more satisfying than aimlessly drinking at some party. As soon as we parked near the trail that led to the river, something strange caught my attention. A man was standing there, just a few yards away. He wore clothes appropriate for the winter chill, but something seemed off. He did nothing but stare at the truck for a moment. I initially thought he might be there to fish too, but I soon realized he was alternating his gaze between his phone and us. That made me uncomfortable. I mentioned it to the others. Tyler shrugged it off, and Mark signaled that he had noticed too, but nobody said anything more about it. While we were unloading our gear, the man approached us. His expression had changed completely. He looked distressed. He explained hurriedly that someone had just fallen into the river, where the current would have carried them to a deeper section. He showed us his phone nervously, saying that someone from his group had just alerted him. The anguish on his face seemed genuine, impossible to ignore. Without hesitation, Tyler jumped out of the truck, and we all quickly followed the man, who darted ahead, guiding us along the trail to where the accident supposedly happened. No one remembered to grab hats or thermal gear. The urgency in his words caught us off guard. He moved forward almost at a run, and we tried to keep up. As we approached the river, something began to bother me. We weren't heading toward our usual fishing spots, where the bottom is safer and access is easy. Instead, we were being led to a more remote area known for its mud pits and stronger whirlpools. I thought about saying something, but everything was happening too quickly. That's when we spotted two more people near the riverbank. They didn't look like anglers, and they barely moved, just observing us as we approached. I looked at their hands and realized they were armed. My heart froze. One of them shouted for us to stop immediately and pointed his gun directly at me. There are no words to describe the panic of finding yourself at gunpoint. It's a fear that paralyzes you. The man who had brought us there turned to us with a cynical smile. Only then did I realize it was an ambush. The other guy ordered us to hand over Mark's car keys and everything we had in our pockets. There was no choice. Their tone made it clear they weren't joking. Mark hesitantly took the keys from his pocket and handed them over. We followed the same gesture, emptying our pockets. I tried to hide my phone, but one of them noticed and demanded our phones. Mark responded that his was in the truck, and they laughed mockingly. I was overcome with anger, but we were powerless. If they hadn't been armed, I would have reacted in seconds. They took everything and forced us to walk back along the trail while keeping us at gunpoint. One of them got into Mark's truck and drove off in a hurry. The other two disappeared into the woods, probably where they had left their own vehicle. We stood there, shivering from both cold and indignation. That's when Mark pulled a phone from his pocket. He had lied. He hadn't handed over his phone. That was a momentary relief. Using the device, we called the police, explaining what had happened with as much detail as possible. They instructed us to stay put and wait for help. We remained there, trying to shelter ourselves as best we could. I was torn between fear and rage. Mark seemed even more shaken. He started kicking nearby trees, shouting in frustration. Tyler tried to calm him down, but it didn't help much. Everything had happened so quickly that my head was still trying to understand what had just occurred. It didn't make sense what those people were doing there in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve. The situation seemed surreal. I'll skip the more monotonous part. The police arrived, filed the report, and took us to Tyler's house, which was the closest. As we had already assumed, Mark's truck was never recovered, nor were the culprits caught. To this day, the three of us still struggle to believe this really happened. Tyler thinks it was pure bad luck, that we crossed paths with those people at the wrong moment and became an easy target. Maybe he's right, but to me, it's strange that they were there in that remote place, waiting for someone. It doesn't make sense that they seemed so certain they would find someone that night. What troubles me most, though, is something I never shared with Mark or Tyler. As we were being marched back through the woods at gunpoint, I noticed something in the distance through a clearing, two more vehicles hidden under camouflage tarps, and what looked like several large containers. They weren't just random thieves. This was organized, planned. Sometimes I wonder if what they stole from us was just a bonus, and what they were really doing out there that night was something far more sinister. Since then, I've spent every New Year's Eve locked in my apartment, the tradition broken. Some things change you forever, and some traditions aren't worth the risk of reviving. Still, on quiet nights, I find myself missing those peaceful moments by the water, before the world revealed how quickly serenity can shatter. In the early 80s, Our family gatherings at my grandparents' lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota were the cornerstone of my childhood summers. Their wooden retreat, nestled among towering pines beside Lake Waskish, became a hub of activity every 4th of July weekend. All the cousins would congregate there, creating memories that still accompany me to this day. It was during one of those warm July evenings, while we were waiting for the fireworks to begin, that one of my uncles decided, at the last minute, to drive down to the local general store. These country stores, selling ice, snacks, and most importantly beer, were typically open until late and were indispensable for celebrations like ours. With him gone, the cabin was bustling with activity. My aunts were in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on dinner. Uncles were out on the deck preparing the grill for barbecue, and we children were playing throughout the surrounding woods. That particular evening, we decided to explore an abandoned ranger station that stood about a quarter-mile from my grandparents' cabin. It was a small, deteriorating wooden structure that had been empty for years, silent and mysterious in the fading daylight. We ran through the forest, crossing overgrown paths until, as we emerged from behind the station, we witnessed something that left an indelible mark on my memory. A massive bird, enormous beyond belief, was flying low. So low that it seemed to brush against the treetops around the ranger station. We froze in place for a moment, but soon fear propelled us back toward the safety of the cabin. We didn't tell anyone about what we'd seen, afraid we'd be scolded for venturing to such a dark and potentially dangerous place. We tried to convince ourselves it was just an ordinary bird, perhaps an eagle or an owl, but something didn't make sense. Still, we were children, and simple explanations seemed sufficient to calm our nerves. Not long after, my uncle returned from the general store, visibly shaken. Everyone gathered around him, asking what had happened. Nervously, he explained that he had seen a woman dressed entirely in black. According to him, she was gliding, almost flying down the road, before disappearing into the same woods where we had been playing minutes earlier. My aunts mocked him, saying he must have had too much to drink, that what he was describing was impossible. But as extraordinary as it seemed, I knew he wasn't lying. This uncle never drank excessively, and that night he hadn't even had a single beer. We children remained silent, not mentioning the giant bird. My uncle's account only intensified our fear. It wasn't the first time we'd heard stories about witches in those woods. In fact, even today, there are those who tell of similar experiences around Lake Waskish. Many of my relatives have also spoken about enormous birds crossing the night sky, particularly between the 80s and early 2000s. But there's another incident I experienced during those summers that still gives me chills to this day. My grandparents had always lived in that cabin, and right beside the front porch stood a massive pine tree, easily reaching 60 feet tall, with thick branches and dense needles. During the night, it was common to hear something large moving within its upper branches, causing the top to sway in an unsettling manner. Curious, we would go outside to investigate, but never found anything. We thought it might be raccoons, maybe an owl, or perhaps even a black bear cub that had climbed up there. But our searches never revealed any sign of creatures. Even during daylight hours, the tree appeared completely undisturbed. My grandmother was particularly bothered by this, since her bedroom window was very close to the tree, less than 5 feet away. The sound of the branches moving was unmistakable, as if something heavy was nesting within, but the source remained a mystery. This continued for quite some time, until one day when we climbed up to the cabin's observation deck on the second floor to store some fishing equipment. From that vantage point, we noticed something strange. The top of the pine tree was flattened, as if something of considerable size had compressed the crown. The shape was well defined, resembling the mark of a giant sphere that had settled there, like a ball of clay that had been pressed down. The size was disproportionate to any bird we could imagine, even the largest eagles or great horned owls. This left us without explanation. A few days later, someone decided to cut down the upper portion of the tree and trim back the branches nearest to the house. From that point on, the mysterious noises ceased, and the nights returned to being peaceful in that corner of the property. But sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings when the wind rustles through the remaining pines, I still catch myself glancing upward, wondering what exactly had made its home in those branches all those years ago. And occasionally, when visiting my grandparents' old cabin, now owned by my cousin, I notice how the neighboring trees seem to bend slightly away from where that old pine once stood, as if still maintaining a respectful distance from something only they can sense. When we were little, we spent every holiday season at my grandmother's house in Harvest Hill, a small town nestled between rolling fields and dense forests in rural New England. Thanksgiving and Christmas were magical there, the house filled with warmth, laughter, and family traditions that seemed timeless. As the evening celebrations stretched into the night, we children would run wild through the old Victorian home, its creaking floorboards and hidden nooks perfect for our games of hide-and-seek. The adults would continue their festivities, loud music, clinking glasses, and animated conversations flowing like the wine they poured. Eventually, when it grew late, but we still refused to go to bed, our uncles and aunts would exchange knowing glances across the room. They'd begin talking among themselves, their voices pitched just loudly enough for us to overhear. Despite their casual tone, there was always an undercurrent of seriousness beneath their words. Children really shouldn't be awake this late in Harvest Hill, one would say. Especially not during the winter solstice. Remember what happened to the Miller boy back in '78. Another would reply. Never seen again after midnight. Sometimes they mentioned witches who prowled the snow-covered streets. Other times, they'd simply say children vanished without explanation during these special nights. The younger we were, the more frightened we became, enough to send us scurrying to our beds without protest, though we weren't entirely sure if these stories were truth or merely a clever trick to make us sleep. Their warnings always came with mischievous smiles, the kind adults wear when they're playing a harmless prank on children. As they switched off the lights and closed our bedroom door, we'd huddle under quilts, listening for strange sounds outside the frost-covered windows. Years passed. We grew up. Those family gatherings at grandmother's house became increasingly rare as our lives pulled us in different directions. Some family members had passed away, and nostalgia made these memories even more precious when we did manage to reunite in that old house. During one such gathering, my sister, always the most inquisitive among us, asked about that peculiar habit they had of scaring us to bed with stories of disappearances. She wanted to know where the tradition originated. At first, everyone laughed, remembering our terrified faces. But suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A subtle tension filled the room, and I didn't immediately understand why until my eldest aunt decided to speak. She explained that when our family first moved to that house in Harvest Hill in the early 1960s, they began noticing a disturbing pattern during the winter holidays. Children from the surrounding area would disappear. Local families lived in constant vigilance, keeping lights burning through the night and watching their young ones carefully. But there was always the unspoken fear that the culprit might be someone they knew. My uncles believed that during the festive season, people became more careless, more vulnerable, and that's when the disappearances would occur. One uncle, who rarely spoke of such things, told us about a young couple he knew well who lived just down the road. They had a child very young in life, but the baby never reached its first birthday. The infant vanished without a trace, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of what might have happened. Some neighbors whispered that the couple, being young and unprepared for parenthood, had done something terrible themselves. But my uncle insisted he knew them well enough to recognize their devastation was genuine. Besides enduring the loss, they also carried the burden of gossip and suspicion until they finally moved away to Boston, seeking a fresh start. In our community, two theories circulated. Some believed the disappearances were the work of someone living among them. Others, more superstitious folks, blamed witchcraft, pointing to the town's complicated history with the occult dating back to colonial times. What was strange was that the disappearances always occurred during the same period, the darkest days of December, surrounding the winter solstice. My uncles were convinced it was witchcraft, while other families preferred to think it was something human, though equally sinister. One detail united all the stories. The children who vanished were never baptized or dedicated in any religious ceremony. When we grew a little older, I remember most of us, cousins, were suddenly taken to church for baptism. They explained it was for our protection. Curious, I asked why they hadn't done this when we were babies, since it seemed such a simple solution. That's when the subject of my grandmother arose. She believed each person should make their own choice about spiritual matters, that something so important shouldn't be imposed from an early age. Today, I can appreciate how progressive her stance was for her generation, but I know it left our parents constantly anxious. What they never told us until that night was how much they had feared for us during those holiday gatherings. The vigilance disguised as festivities, the rotation system they had established, so someone was always watching us, even during the height of celebration. The special locks my grandfather had installed on all the windows. Do you remember that strange pendant grandmother always made you wear during December? My aunt asked. I touched my neck reflexively, remembering the odd silver charm embossed with symbols I couldn't read. That was her compromise, an old protection charm passed down through her family for generations. My mother finally spoke up. We thought it was just superstition, but we were desperate enough to try anything. Her voice trembled slightly. After what happened to your cousin Thomas, the room went silent. I looked around confused. We don't have a cousin Thomas, I said, The glances exchanged around the room told me everything I needed to know before another word was spoken. We had once had a cousin Thomas, grandmother's first grandchild, born in the middle of December, 5 years before I came into the world. Unbaptized, unprotected by the silver charms that came later, he had vanished from his crib during the winter solstice celebration of 1972. The official investigation concluded that a window had been left open, though my aunts and uncles swore it had been locked. That night changed our family forever. It was why grandmother insisted on hosting every holiday gathering afterward, to keep us all together, protected under her roof with her strange rituals and silent vigilance. But why keep telling us those scary stories? My sister pressed. Why not just tell us the truth? My father sighed. Because a frightened child stays put. A curious one goes looking for answers. As we drove home that night, the winter moon illuminating the old forests surrounding Harvest Hill, I couldn't help but wonder about all those years of protection we never knew we needed, and about the traditions we carry forward, often without understanding their origins. I have my own children now, and though we live hundreds of miles from Harvest Hill, when December comes and the nights grow long, I find myself checking the locks twice. And sometimes, when my children won't go to bed during our holiday gatherings, I hear myself saying, children shouldn't be up this late during the solstice. Old habits and old fears are hard to break, especially when they're woven into the fabric of family history. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if those silver charms my grandmother gave me are still in the attic box where I stored them years ago. Just in case. It was the 23rd of November, the day before Thanksgiving, when my colleague Nathan asked me to watch his dog Pepper for the long weekend while he visited family in another state. At 41 years old, with Nathan being only 29, we clearly had different priorities in life. Large family gatherings didn't appeal to me much anymore, and the idea of making some extra cash while spending a quiet holiday weekend alone sounded perfect. That year Thanksgiving fell on a Thursday, and Nathan left early, before the morning fog had lifted from the Seattle streets. He gave me simple instructions. Feed Pepper, take her for walks twice daily, and keep her off the furniture. Pepper, a small mixed terrier, barely a third the size of a standard terrier, was so well behaved that Nathan trusted me instead of hiring a professional pet sitter. I'd only met her a few times when visiting Nathan's place for our occasional movie nights. I arrived with my backpack containing the essentials: laptop, charger, toiletries, and a change of clothes. Nathan and I weren't particularly close. We worked at the same tech startup and occasionally hung out on weekends with mutual friends. I was to sleep in the guest room where there was a comfortable daybed. The day passed uneventfully. I spent hours on my laptop, played some games from Nathan's impressive collection, and for the evening, I'd invited my girlfriend Elise over. Nathan had agreed to this, joking, "Just don't use my bed for anything fun." Elise mentioned she'd be working late at the hospital until around 11 and would come straight over afterward, but her commute would take about 45 minutes. While waiting, I was alone with Pepper, watching old noir films in the living room. She stayed close, curled up near my feet. Around 8:30, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, I found a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s, wearing a dark pea coat and carrying a small leather bag. She introduced herself as Nathan's girlfriend and said she needed to retrieve something she had left in his apartment. Being cautious, I texted Nathan, "Didn't know you were seeing someone." While waiting for a response, she remained upstairs for quite some time. When she finally came back downstairs, she was carrying what looked like a jewelry box. She thanked me and was about to leave when I decided to make conversation. "How long have you two been together?" I asked. She responded with an unexpected laugh, more amused than the question warranted. "Longer than I should have been," she said cryptically. Her laughter seemed like an inside joke I wasn't privy to, and I found myself laughing awkwardly along with her. Then she simply said, "Have a good night," and left. The interaction felt off somehow. I began wondering if perhaps they had recently broken up, which might explain her tone. But something nagged at me. Should I have allowed her inside? Nathan still hadn't responded to my message. I called him several times until he finally answered, the sounds of family chaos in the background. "A woman just came by saying she was your girlfriend. She took something from your bedroom," I explained. Nathan sounded confused. "What are you talking about?" "She said she was my girlfriend." "Yes," I replied. "I didn't ask her name." "You know I'm not seeing anyone right now," he exclaimed. "What did she look like?" At that moment, the realization of how naive I'd been hit me hard. I described the woman to Nathan, but he insisted he had no idea who she could be. When I told him she had spent several minutes in his bedroom, he became alarmed. "Go check right now if she took anything important," he urged. I immediately went upstairs, but not knowing exactly what had been there before, Nathan began describing specific items for me to check. Everything seemed to be in place. On the other end of the line, he was trying to piece together this puzzle, saying he would make some calls and send me photos to try to identify the mysterious visitor. There was no doubt this had ruined his evening with his family. Worse yet, I could tell he was distracted and worried, which only made me feel more guilty for having let that stranger into his home. Nathan started sending Instagram profile screenshots, but none matched the description I gave. After a period of silence, he sent a message. "I think I know who it was. Just make sure she doesn't come back." I didn't press for more details, simply replying, "I'm sorry for my mistake," and left it at that. I assumed Nathan was dealing with some complicated situation with a woman from his past. The evening passed quietly as Thanksgiving Day officially began. I've never been particularly attached to the countdown to midnight or watching parades on TV. Late that night, Elise finally arrived, and we relaxed in the living room. I told her about what had happened, and she was disturbed by the story. Then something strange occurred. Pepper, who had been lying quietly, suddenly raised her head and stared intently at the front door. Moments later, we heard soft knocking. Whoever it was didn't use the doorbell this time. I didn't open the door under any circumstances. I called Nathan repeatedly, but he didn't answer, probably too caught up in family festivities to notice his phone. Elise and I remained absolutely silent until the footsteps outside faded away. It was obvious this had something to do with the woman from earlier. Perhaps it was her again. We decided not to get more involved and retreated to the guest room. Settling onto the daybed, and watching a movie while trying to relax in each other's arms. We eventually dozed off, but less than an hour later, I woke to Pepper whining. She was in the room with us, standing near the door, tail wagging nervously and making anxious sounds. I woke Elise, who immediately noticed the dog's strange behavior. "Pepper, quiet," I whispered. She looked at me but kept her focus on the door, now growling and whimpering restlessly. That's when we heard footsteps outside on the hardwood floor. It sounded like at least 2 people walking on tiptoe toward the door. The handle began to turn. Fortunately, we had locked the door out of habit. A female voice called out, "Nathan." I looked at Elise and signaled for her to remain silent. This woman wasn't alone. Another knock on the door, and then she spoke again. "Who's in there?" "This is Nathan's place." I took a deep breath and in a loud, almost shouting voice declared, "The police have already been called a few minutes ago, just so you know." The woman responded, "Who are you?" I completely ignored her question and quietly asked Elise to actually call the police. She dialed, whispering, as she explained the situation. Meanwhile, I continued, "You can try something, but know that the moment you do, the police will be here to deal with you." We heard footsteps retreating after a brief whisper from the other side. Elise and I remained in the room, waiting for the police to arrive. When the officers got there, the front door, which I had left unlocked during the day, made their entry easy. The house was empty by then. I reported everything that had happened, trying to explain the events while calling Nathan repeatedly, until he finally answered, clearly concerned. One of the officers took the phone to speak with him, while the other listened to Elise's and my account. When everything was clarified, the conclusion was that the woman from earlier had taken a spare key from Nathan's bedroom. It was a complicated moment. Nathan, unable to return at that hour from 3 states away, practically begged me to stay until morning. I decided to send Elise home in a rideshare, taking responsibility since I was the one who had allowed that woman to enter. I locked myself in the bedroom with Pepper and spent the rest of the night there. As an extra improvised measure, I placed a heavy chair against the front door, hoping it would be enough if they tried to return. By morning, it seemed the night had been uneventful, with no sign of anyone returning. Nathan arrived earlier than planned. I won't go into many details about what he shared to preserve his privacy. However, he revealed who he believed the woman was, and the story was enough to make me reflect that men also need to be careful about the people they become involved with. The most frightening realization was that her objective, and whoever was with her, didn't seem to be theft. That made everything even more unsettling. Nathan changed the locks immediately. I often wonder what might have happened if it had been him alone in the apartment that night. It's been 3 years since the incident, and as far as I know, there haven't been any further problems. Unless, of course, Nathan has decided to keep that to himself. My name is Sarah, and today I want to share a memory that has never left my mind since my grandfather decided to leave city life behind and settle in the remote hills of Appalachia. He abandoned the suburban existence where he had raised his children and rarely returns to visit us now. When he does appear, it's usually out of necessity to handle important matters or in cases of family illness. Otherwise, it's uncommon for him to come to the city. So we, his family, make the journey to his homestead during holiday seasons. Grandfather has always been a man of integrity, dedication, and charisma. Many in our hometown still miss his presence, as he was known for his kindness and the meaningful friendships he cultivated over decades. I particularly remember one year during the Christmas holidays when we arrived at his homestead around noon, but couldn't find him anywhere. My uncles, who had arrived about an hour before us, hadn't seen him either. It was only half an hour later that he pulled up in his old pickup truck. He knew we would be there waiting, yet he greeted us casually, as if nothing was amiss. We immediately asked where he had been. He explained that he had befriended a neighbor whose property was in the vicinity, though it required a fair drive to reach. According to him, the man was a newcomer, quite amiable and evidently wealthy, who had purchased the property just a few months ago. Out of courtesy, my grandfather had taken him a bottle of homemade bourbon as a gift, since the neighbor was also expecting family for the holiday celebrations. Conversation flowed freely throughout the rest of the day. We had dinner, night fell, and we continued enjoying each other's company. I was just a child at the time, probably 11 or 12 years old, but I remember that Christmas vividly. The details of the festivities aren't important now, so I'll skip to what truly matters. On the morning of New Year's Day, my grandfather, as always, was up before sunrise. My father, also accustomed to early rising, joined him for a walk around the property and surrounding areas. Several hours later, when we were beginning to prepare the traditional leftover feast, the two returned, visibly shaken, though they tried to conceal it. Even as children, we sensed something was wrong. While my mother and aunts attempted to distract us, the men stepped outside to talk. Curious, I told my mother I needed to use the bathroom, but instead, I hid behind an old tractor parked beside the house. From there, I could hear their conversation. My father and grandfather recounted that during their walk, grandfather had insisted on visiting the neighbor, despite my father suggesting it might be too early, considering they might be resting after the previous night's festivities. Nevertheless, they went. As they approached the property, they noticed smoke rising from the chimney and an elderly woman crossing the wooden gate that marked the entrance to the land. She acknowledged them with a simple hand gesture and continued on her way. The door to the house was slightly ajar, and calling out for the neighbor, my father and grandfather decided to enter and check on him. However, as they advanced, they found no one, and everything was eerily silent. I should explain that in many mountain homesteads, the main house often sits quite a distance from the main gate, requiring a walk of about 150 to 200 feet or so. Cautiously, they proceeded forward, not wanting to startle anyone. It was in the dining room that they encountered the horrific scene. The bodies of my grandfather's neighbor, 2 of his children, and 5 grandchildren, all brutally murdered, apparently with some kind of bladed weapon. The floor was covered with small twigs and branches, something they couldn't understand at that moment. Without delay, they ran out to seek police help and an ambulance. At that moment, they remembered the elderly woman they had seen leaving minutes before, but she seemed to have vanished. When the police arrived, they asked few questions, only wanting to know the details of what my father and grandfather had witnessed. When they mentioned the woman, One of the officers who had some familiarity with my grandfather leaned in discreetly and said in a low voice, "If you ever see her again, avoid greeting her or looking directly at her." According to him, that woman was no ordinary person. There were suspicions that someone might have hired her for this act, but the officer mentioned she had been seen around those parts for a long time. The being around came with quotation marks because nobody knew exactly where she lived. She was only occasionally spotted in local businesses where some would greet her. The police had already connected her presence to other tragic events, but none as terrible as this one. After this incident, my parents and uncles became concerned about my grandfather's safety. They prayed, sought spiritual protection, and remained on high alert, fearing this woman might directly harm him. We never managed to clarify who she was. To say she was a witch seems plausible considering the rumors and stories told about her. But I don't know if it's that simple. To this day, I feel a chill when I remember, especially because my grandfather still reports seeing her wandering near his homestead. Sometimes in the early dawn, sometimes at dusk, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, watching. The local authorities have never been able to locate her, despite numerous searches after similar incidents were reported in neighboring counties. What would you make of something like this? There's no denying it's strange and deeply disturbing. The property where the massacre occurred has remained abandoned since that day, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. People in the nearby town avoid even mentioning it, as if speaking about the tragedy might somehow summon that mysterious figure to their own homes. Grandfather has refused to leave his homestead despite our pleading. He says he's not afraid of her. In fact, he believes he's somehow protected. The last time I visited him, 3 months ago, I found strange markings carved into his door frames and windows. When I asked about them, he simply smiled and said, "Insurance, child. Just insurance." I've often wondered if we should have gone to the authorities with more information, but what more could we say? An elderly woman who appears and disappears, connected to unsolved murders, yet never caught. It sounds like the beginning of a folk tale, not evidence for a criminal investigation. Whatever or whoever she is, the mystery of the woman at the gate continues to haunt our family to this day. Although I try not to highlight this fact too often, I had the privilege of attending a prestigious arts academy in Portland during my teenage years. When I was about 13, around the fall of 2008, my parents' financial situation allowed me to enroll in this exclusive school that offered various specialized workshops and extracurricular programs, along with hosting social events where family members were invited. One of the events that left the deepest impression on me took place near the end of my final year there. The school organized a showcase of work created in the various workshops. It wasn't exactly a competition, but rather a presentation allowing parents to witness what their children had learned over the year, followed by a dinner and activities reminiscent of a small festival. That particular year, I had the opportunity to perform with the school orchestra, playing the cello alongside several classmates. Among them was a boy. I'll call Nathan to protect his identity. He was visibly excited because, for the first time, not only would his parents be attending, but also his older sister, younger brother, and grandmother, who had traveled all the way from Arizona to see him perform. During our preparations with the workshop instructors, Nathan mentioned that his siblings and grandmother had arrived early, while his parents were running late due to unexpected traffic. Still, he was certain they would make it in time. The performances began, and from a distance, I could identify Nathan's family members. His siblings and grandmother were seated next to two empty chairs, reserved for his parents. There was still hope they would arrive on time. While we were backstage waiting for our turn, Nathan checked his phone for any messages. His face darkened momentarily when he realized his parents still hadn't arrived. I tried to calm him down, suggesting they might show up just in time for our performance. And even if they didn't, we would still deliver a fantastic recital. Our performance wasn't long. It lasted about 15 minutes, and everything went smoothly. I won't elaborate on this, as it's not the central point of this story. When we finished, we gathered in the area behind the small stage that had been set up in the school's auditorium. Amidst the congratulatory words from our instructor, Nathan whispered to me that his father had appeared after all. He wasn't sitting in the reserved seats, but standing at the back near an emergency exit. Nathan found it strange that his mother wasn't with him, but he was relieved to have at least seen his father. After the event, I left with my family to enjoy the evening between dinner and the games available at the festival. Before departing, I looked for my friends to say goodbye. I found almost everyone except Nathan, and assumed he had already gone home with his family. We got into our car, and as I was dozing off in the back seat, I overheard my parents whispering that some people from school had been involved in an accident. They mentioned suspecting it might be Nathan's parents, since no one had seen them at the event. I immediately interrupted, saying that Nathan had seen his father. My parents agreed it was probably a misunderstanding and asked me not to worry. The following day, while chatting on Discord, which had just become popular among my friends, a classmate confirmed that the accident had indeed involved Nathan's parents. They had both died approximately 20 minutes before our performance began. The news left me stunned. I sent Nathan a message trying to console him, but he didn't respond. I simply left the message, hoping he would see it when he felt ready. Days later, I attended the funeral and finally saw him again. When we talked, he confessed that he couldn't understand how he had seen his father that night, since the confirmation was that both his parents had died before our performance even began. Moreover, he wondered why only his father had appeared and not his mother. He wasn't sad as much as disoriented and confused. As the weeks passed, classes resumed to complete the final year of school, but Nathan never returned. He also stopped responding on Discord, and sometime later his account was deactivated. Since then, I completely lost contact with him. Years later, my mother revealed something she had preferred not to tell me at the time, probably to spare me from worries. According to her, Nathan's mother had been involved in what could only be described as occult practices. She supposedly made pacts with entities that my mother couldn't quite explain. She assured me of this with conviction, because she had spent time with Nathan's mother during a volunteer program at the school. According to my mother, after the results of these supposed pacts began to manifest, she decided to distance herself from that woman since she didn't believe in such things. Nevertheless, it was undeniable that, Rather suddenly, Nathan's family began to prosper financially. They moved to a larger house in an upscale neighborhood and began living much more comfortably, though they kept driving the same old station wagon, perhaps to avoid drawing attention. Despite their newfound wealth, Nathan's mother seemed to live in constant fear, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. My mother believes that on that fateful night, there might have been some kind of settling of accounts with this unknown force or entity. Perhaps that's why Nathan's mother didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye to him, while his father somehow managed to appear to see him one last time. This experience left deep marks on me. I've never known exactly what to think or say about it all. I also never heard news of Nathan or his family again. I like to believe that he moved forward, that he's doing well, and that nothing more was collected from them. There are times when I think about reaching out, trying to find Nathan through social media or mutual connections. But something always holds me back. Perhaps the fear of discovering something I'm not prepared to know. Or maybe it's just the understanding that some goodbyes are meant to be final, even when they happen in ways we can't fully comprehend. In quiet moments, especially during autumn evenings that remind me of that showcase night, I sometimes wonder if Nathan's father really was there, or if it was something else entirely. I've come to accept that some questions may never have answers, and some mysteries are better left unexplored. You know those stories that start so ordinarily that you'd never suspect where they're heading? This is exactly that kind of story, the type that could belong to me, to you, to anyone, until things start to get out of place. I've decided to write this down. Even today, I find myself thinking about what happened, hoping that sharing it might alleviate this strange feeling that lingers. When my 3-year relationship ended, I returned to living alone. I also resumed using Hinge and other dating apps. I'd been following this single routine for several months, during which I met a few people. One of them was Vanessa, a woman I matched with on Hinge. She gave me her Instagram handle, but our contact quickly cooled, turning into that familiar pattern of her watching my stories without any real interaction. This dynamic was common during college, but now, approaching 35, the superficiality of dating apps seemed much more evident and exhausting. I live in a corner townhouse, in a small suburban development outside Portland. I work as a software developer. The pay is good, but the day-to-day is unbearably monotonous. When my girlfriend left, I thought I'd enjoy the privacy and quiet. But to be honest, after the first month, the novelty wore off. Maybe I'm someone who functions better with company. Or perhaps I just need people around because the solitude began to weigh on me. That's why I threw myself into the apps, always trying to schedule dates, more as an excuse to leave the house than anything else. This happened in October last year. I posted something on my Instagram stories about Halloween, and who decided to comment? Vanessa, the one I hadn't spoken to in weeks. She suggested we do something Halloween-themed together, which rekindled our conversation. I considered some festive ideas, a haunted house, visiting a pumpkin patch, but she suggested we carve pumpkins at my place. I mentioned that I hadn't bought any pumpkins yet, because I didn't want to carry them home alone. She offered to help, and I agreed. We set a time for her to come by at 9 in the evening. It was already dark when we made plans. Around 7:45, I remember rushing out of the house with keys in hand to go to the grocery store to buy some craft beer and a couple of pumpkins. When I returned, I tidied up the house, vacuumed, swept the floor, tasks my ex used to handle that were now my responsibility. That's when I realized how quickly the place became messy on its own. When 9 o'clock came, I was sitting on the couch with Netflix playing in the background, pretending to watch a show. I had prepared everything to make the environment cozy and pleasant, but time passed and nothing. I sent a message, "Let me know when you're on your way." I started to think she had changed her mind until around 9:45, I finally received a message, "I'm outside." As soon as she entered, I was surprised to find myself tilting my head up to meet her gaze. She was several inches taller than me, and I'm 6 feet tall. She must have been at least 6'2". I also immediately noticed she wore an overpoweringly strong perfume, almost suffocating. We sat directly on the couch, and she chose to settle very close to the point where our legs were touching. It was then that I began to feel a strange unease. She appeared older than in her photos, perhaps a bit worn out, though it was difficult to put into words. Beneath that overwhelming smell of cheap perfume, a slight body odor completely deflated my interest. "Would you like some beer?" I asked. "Yes, please," she replied. I got up and served 2 bottles while we attempted to make conversation. You know that feeling when you meet someone for the first time after exchanging messages and realize the person isn't anything like you imagined? That's exactly what happened. There was something odd about her, as if certain social cues were missing. I returned with the bottles, handed one to her, and we made a toast. Almost immediately, she spilled a generous amount of beer on my light gray couch. I held back my desire to freak out, though I was furious inside. "It's okay," I said, rushing to the kitchen for paper towels and a damp sponge. I returned and cleaned as quickly as I could to prevent a permanent stain. She apologized repeatedly, and I insisted everything was fine, although the atmosphere had visibly become more tense. To break the discomfort, I suggested we get the pumpkins from my garage. I went down, dragged the large reusable grocery bags with the pumpkins, and began passing them to her, one by one. She picked them up with impressive ease, and I was reminded again of how tall this woman was. When we finished bringing everything to the living room, we started carving the pumpkins to the sound of some indie rock playing from my speaker. I served more beer for both of us, and as we drank, I began to loosen up. After all, a little alcohol always improves any situation. When we finished setting up the pumpkins, I mentioned that I had some old Halloween decorations stored in the crawl space, vintage items from my childhood that my parents had given me along with other seasonal decorations. I left Vanessa in the living room relaxing and went to get the boxes. As I retrieved the decorations from the crawl space, I began to feel strange. A slight dizziness came over me, as if the beer was affecting me more than it should. I've never been a heavy drinker, and I know my tolerance is low, but this felt different. I grabbed the first box and carried it upstairs. As soon as I arrived, I realized Vanessa wasn't in the living room. At first, I thought she had gone to the bathroom, but when I called out to her, there was no response. I began looking around the house, calling her name, and noticed the bathroom was empty. I was confused. I decided to check the bedrooms, but she had simply vanished. I thought about sending her a message through Instagram, but she didn't open it. The situation was becoming increasingly surreal. I couldn't believe what had just happened. She had simply disappeared without warning. I began to wonder if it was something about me. Did she find me weird or unattractive? But to be honest, I wasn't that interested in her either. I collapsed onto the couch, which suddenly seemed more welcoming, and kept checking my phone from time to time to see if she had opened my Instagram message. Meanwhile, I left the TV on whatever was playing. My memory, however, went blank at some point. I only remember that everything went dark. I woke up later in complete darkness. The TV and lights were off. The room felt suffocating. I was still on the couch, feeling extremely weak, almost unable to move my limbs. After a few seconds, I managed to find my phone underneath me. When the screen lit up, the light revealed the silhouette of someone standing right in front of me. For some reason, I didn't scream. I just put the phone down, plunging the room back into darkness. Finally, I managed to ask, "Vanessa." I expected it to be her, but my mind was still confused about what had happened before. Whoever was there didn't respond. I picked up my phone again and turned on the flashlight. It was her. Vanessa was standing there, staring at me. She didn't move, just stared fixedly. I was still trapped on the couch, paralyzed. I don't know if from pure fear or whatever she had put in my drink. My muscles barely responded, and I felt incredibly vulnerable. I could only murmur her name a few more times. Then suddenly, she turned and ran toward the stairs. I swear I've never heard footsteps so loud and pronounced, as if they echoed throughout the entire house. A strong sound reverberated downstairs. Later, I realized it must have been the front door. In those first minutes after waking up, everything seemed surreal. With time, my mind cleared, and I began to regain movement in my limbs. I picked up my phone again and checked Instagram. Her account had disappeared. She had blocked me. I looked out the front window, and there were no cars besides mine and the neighbors. Only then did I realize that I had never noticed if she arrived by car or how she had come. I searched the entire house from top to bottom, looking for signs of theft. Nothing seemed to have been taken until I noticed the pattern. All the pill bottles I had in the house were gone, my vitamins, supplements, the bottle of Adderall, and even a vial of Percocet kept since a surgery. Additionally, a bottle of expensive whiskey from my mini fridge was also missing. Other than that, nothing else seemed to be missing. Without thinking twice, I called the police and reported the theft. I provided the Instagram username she used and explained that I hadn't gotten her number or knew much about her identity beyond the name she gave me. Vanessa Martinez. The police went to my neighbor's house, since our townhomes are connected. It was late, around 2 in the morning, but they knocked on his door anyway. I was beside them while they asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He replied that he hadn't, that he was sleeping. After about 20 minutes, they left. I checked again to make sure all my locks were secure to ensure she couldn't come back in. But ultimately, this person called Vanessa disappeared without leaving any trace. From the first minutes, something about her behavior already seemed abnormal to me. Now it all makes sense. I don't consider this just a hypothesis. I know it's the truth. I believe she was older than she claimed and possibly homeless, with a serious drug addiction. I'm certain that bath of strong perfume was an attempt to mask the body odor that was still perceptible. And she clearly put something in my drink while I was in the crawl space. I have no idea how long I was unconscious, but it was enough for her to ransack my house in search of anything that could pass for medication or supplements. The image of her standing motionless and imposing in front of me when I woke up still disturbs me. It was something so disconcerting that, to be honest, I didn't even have the courage to put up any Halloween decorations that year. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if she had more sinister intentions. I've since installed a security system, and I'm much more cautious about who I invite into my home. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining her standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those unblinking eyes. Dating apps are supposed to connect people, but sometimes they connect you with something much darker than you ever expected. I want to share something truly haunting that happened to me when I was just 13 years old back in 2009. It's remarkable how distant that time feels now, how swiftly the years have passed. Despite this, the event I'm about to describe remains etched in my memory with startling clarity, perhaps because even today, it still sends chills down my spine. That summer, our family decided to spend the 4th of July weekend at my Uncle David's lake house in rural Maine. He had married my Aunt Rebecca only a few years earlier, but they had only recently begun reconnecting with our side of the family. Her husband, Nikolai, was a Russian man almost 25 years her senior, but he seemed kind-hearted and treated my aunt extraordinarily well. Still, we knew very little about him back then, and the communication barrier. He spoke minimal English with a thick accent, created distance between us. Nikolai had ended up in Maine because his elderly great-uncle had decided to retire in this remote lakeside community, where he eventually passed away. That's when Nikolai discovered that his great-uncle not only owned property there, but had left it to him in his will. The house was enormous, nestled in dense pine forest with its back facing a serene lake. That Independence Day weekend, it was filled with relatives, both from his side, who had flown in from various parts of Eastern Europe and from our side of the family. It was one of the most magnificent holiday gatherings I've ever experienced. Food in abundance, lively music, and an atmosphere that seemed perfect. All of this lasted until shortly after 11 at night, when, unexpectedly, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from across the lake. The sudden downpour, however, didn't dampen people's spirits. They simply sought shelter under the large covered deck and continued celebrating. I, however, was already exhausted and decided it was time to rest. My aunt led me to a bedroom, far removed from the noise of the party. It was on the lowest level of the house, partially built into the hillside that sloped down toward the lake. She assured me my cousins would join me soon, and that I could sleep peacefully, because only they had the key to the room. Following her advice, I lay down and began to relax, nearly drifting off to sleep when something, perhaps an intuition, I'm not sure exactly, suddenly made me snap awake, instantly alert. The room had a large window without curtains, something I hadn't even noticed before. But at that moment, an inexplicable fear took hold of me. I felt with absolute certainty that someone was outside, watching. For several long minutes, I fought against the impulse to look, but curiosity eventually won. Pretending to simply shift positions in my sleep, I discreetly opened my eyes and peered toward the window. That's when I saw him, the silhouette of an elderly man standing there, observing me. A shiver ran through my entire body. My mind filled with terror, but I didn't know how to react. I didn't scream, fearing he might try to break in to silence me. I also didn't dare to run, worried he could somehow catch me. I remained motionless, trying to devise an escape, though my eyes were only half open. I had the distinct impression that he was trying to force the window open. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating his face, gaunt, with deeply sunken eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural bluish tint. In that instant, I gathered my courage, took a deep breath, mentally counted to 3, and barefoot dashed out of the room. In the hallway, I ran into my cousins, who were just arriving at that very moment. They embraced me, alarmed at seeing me crying, and wanted to know what had happened. With a trembling voice, I explained that a man had tried to enter through the window. "I told you it was real," one of my cousins said to the other. The two walked toward the room, and I followed them, still trying to understand why they seemed so calm. I suggested that we should alert my parents or my aunt and uncle, but they simply asked me to stay with them. As soon as they reached the room, one of them pointed. "It's this window, right?" I nodded. She turned on the light beside the window, revealing something that left me even more confused. Right behind the window was a solid stone wall. She opened the window and asked us to come closer. I hesitated but did as she asked. It was then that I realized that stone wall was real, solid and ancient looking. There was only a narrow gap of about 4 inches separating the window from the wall of rough-hewn granite blocks. As I examined it, my other cousin mentioned that she had also slept there once, arriving late at night. She recounted that at first she thought she was dreaming. She heard someone calling to her, asking her to open the window and let him in. When she realized she was awake, fear took over. The voice was distinct and persistent. Like me, she had her back to the window. And what terrified her most was hearing tapping on the glass accompanied by the same plea. The voice said it was cold outside and begged to be let in. She tried to ignore the sound until sleep finally overcame her. The next morning, she rushed out of that room without looking back. My cousin explained that according to Aunt Rebecca, nobody knew exactly why a wall had been built so close to that window. The stone barrier was already there when Nikolai inherited the house. But apparently, almost every woman who had slept there, especially younger ones like us, ended up seeing something at the window. Sometimes it was just a dark shadow. Other times, like in my case, they could clearly see an elderly man peering through it. What my cousins told me next made everything even more disturbing. They had found old journals in the attic belonging to Nikolai's great uncle. The entries revealed that he had deliberately walled up that window after a series of inexplicable occurrences. Apparently, the original owner of the house, the one who built it in the late 19th century, had a peculiar habit of watching young women in the village through their bedroom windows. After his death by drowning in the lake, Reports emerged of his figure appearing at windows throughout the area, always asking to be let in, claiming he was cold from the lake water. I refused to look at photographs of the original owner, just imagining that he might have the same face as the man I saw that night gave me goosebumps. Worse still was thinking about what he might have done in life to remain trapped there, tormenting those who slept in that room. The strangest part came the following morning. My aunt and Nikolai were in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. When they noticed me, they fell silent immediately. Later that day, I overheard Nikolai telling someone on the phone about another incident in the lower bedroom. He mentioned something about consecutive years and always on the anniversary. It wasn't until years later that I discovered the house had been built on land where an old boarding school for girls once stood before burning down under mysterious circumstances. The original owner had been the headmaster, who survived the fire, but was later found drowned in the lake under suspicious circumstances. I try to avoid thinking about it, but on stormy nights like that one, the memory always returns. No matter where I am, I feel compelled to get up and close all the curtains. And when I sleep with my back to window, I can't shake the sensation that he's still there, watching, waiting to be invited in from the cold. I'm a single mother to a little boy named Leo, who just turned 8. When everything happened, he was 5 and I was 32. We live in a cozy lakeside cottage I inherited from my grandparents in a quiet town, mostly populated by retirees and summer vacationers. We still live here together, just the two of us. It was during the 4th of July weekend, and I'd taken Leo to the Boardwalk Carnival to buy some gifts for family and enjoy the holiday festivities. We wandered through various vendor stalls, stopping at a handmade crafts shop where I picked out a beautiful carved wooden box for my father. After finishing our shopping, we took a break at a seaside ice cream parlor for sundaes and lemonade. As we were leaving through the east exit of the boardwalk, we encountered a carnival clown standing just outside, waving cheerfully at passing families. He greeted us with typical clown phrases and knelt down to Leo's level, asking what he wanted for his birthday, which was coming up later that month. "What would you like for your birthday, little buddy?" he asked. Leo, pulling my hand closer to the clown, responded naturally. "I want a skateboard with light-up wheels." The ironic detail is that this was exactly the gift I had already decided to buy him that year. The clown laughed good-naturedly. "If you're good, who knows what you might get right," he said, winking at me playfully. I returned his smile. He stood up and began complimenting me. "Leo, did you know your mom is a really beautiful woman?" Leo giggled without fully understanding what that meant, while I maintained a polite smile. The man continued making conversation about the holiday rush, mentioned he was an employee at the carnival, and at some point, without thinking too much about it, I commented on how exhausting it was being a single mother during holidays, joking that I even needed a clown's help to get through it. That's when he, in what seemed like a joking tone, or so I thought at the time, asked Leo, "Have you ever heard that song, 'I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus'?" Leo nodded. At that moment, the clown leaned toward me, pointing to his own cheek as if asking for a kiss. I thought it would be something innocent and approached, but at the last second, he turned his face, trying to kiss me on the lips. I reacted in time, turning away. But the situation was so unexpected and aggressive that it left me feeling violated. He let out a typical clown laugh, but there was nothing cheerful about it. "Let's go, Leo," I said without hiding my irritation as we walked away. "Happy Independence Day," he shouted. That was the last thing I heard from him before leaving. As I drove around to exit through the back of the boardwalk parking lot, I noticed he was no longer at the entrance. I should have paid more attention to this detail. Arriving home, I carried the bags inside, locked the door, and prepared for a quiet evening with Leo. We put on a patriotic movie to watch together, but our tranquility was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was too late for unexpected visitors. I asked Leo to stay on the couch and went to the door. "Who is it?" I asked. The response from a man on the other side made me shudder. "It's the clown from the carnival." My heart raced. "If you're the clown from the boardwalk, go away or I'm calling the police," I warned, trying to sound firm. He responded, "Ma'am, you dropped something from your bag." "I'm just trying to return it." My breathing became tense. "What did I drop?" "I don't know, ma'am, I didn't look, but if you open the door, I can give it back." I insisted he leave immediately. I decided to call the boardwalk management and report what had happened. To my surprise, the person who answered informed me that the boardwalk didn't officially hire clowns for the holiday weekend, and anyone dressed as such was acting independently. This left me completely unsettled. I returned to Leo, but my mind was restless, and an unpleasant knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. I made up an excuse to get up again after a few minutes and went to the kitchen, trying to calm myself. I lifted the blind on the window, but couldn't see anything outside. The kitchen light was on, and outside everything was shrouded in darkness. Then I heard a sound that froze my blood, a quiet, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from outside. He was probably watching me at that very moment. I saw no alternative but to call the police, explaining that a man dressed as a clown had followed me home. I asked Leo to continue watching the movie while I spoke with the officers in the yard. They recorded the incident and left. Despite a brief relief, I couldn't completely relax. A few nights later, around the same time, the doorbell rang again. Leo was already asleep, and I was watching TV in the living room. I turned off the set and went straight up to my bedroom, which is next to Leo's. The doorbell didn't ring again, but I decided I wouldn't go downstairs that night. The next day, as I was leaving the house, I noticed a note stuck to the front door. It was typed and printed, and reading it left me stunned. I took a photo before handing it to the police. It said, "I'll get straight to the point. I'm sure you know who I am. I didn't mean to frighten you the other day. It's just that after pretending to be a carnival performer for so many hours and talking with such a beautiful woman, my hormones got out of control. You and your son are adorable, and I would love to someday be part of your family. Don't pretend you didn't feel the connection we had that night. I already know where you live. All I need is your number. Feel free to text me. Maybe we can arrange something. I know this might sound scary or excessive, but I'm the kind of person who pursues what they like. Anyway, happy holidays in case we don't talk. Here's my number." Signed, Marcus. My immediate reaction was revulsion. I wanted to crumple the note right there, But instead, I gave it to the police along with the photo and the information from the number he left. I told them I wanted a solution to the problem. The following Monday, I received a call from someone I believe was a detective. He assured me that the man would not contact me again, but if he did, I should notify them immediately. I never heard from that individual again. I imagine the police threatened him with some legal action to keep him away. For a long time after that, I couldn't look at carnival performers the same way, and I installed additional security cameras around our cottage, along with motion sensor lights that illuminate every corner of our property at night. Leo still doesn't know the full extent of what happened. I told him it was just a confused fan of mine from when I used to work at the local radio station years ago. When the next 4th of July came around, we celebrated at home instead. And I bought Leo that skateboard with light-up wheels. Some memories are worth preserving. Others are best left behind in the darkness where they belong. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.